Chapter 1. The Quirk had no name because no one had ever needed one. Izuku Midoriya sat alone in the diagnostic ward of an unmarked research annex 3 floors beneath UA's western campus, watching numbers scroll across a monitor that did not seem to understand what it was measuring. The technician who had drawn his blood 20 minutes earlier had not returned. Through the reinforced glass of the observation window, 2 more technicians stood with their backs to him, speaking in tones too low for ordinary hearing, though Izuku's hearing had stopped being ordinary 3 days ago. It had started with a tide. He had been sparring with Bakugo in the support course's reinforced gymnasium, nothing unusual, nothing that should have mattered, when a stray burst of his own one for all had clipped a water pipe in the wall and sent a sheet of pressurized spray across the mat. Izuku remembered the moment the water touched his skin. He remembered it the way a person remembers falling, the half-second of total clarity before the impact, except the impact never came. Instead, something old and patient and enormous had opened its eye somewhere behind his ribs and recognized the water as something it had been missing for a very long time. He had not transformed that day. The thing inside him had only stirred, rolled over, and gone back to sleep, leaving Izuku on his knees on the wet mat with his vision tunneling and the taste of salt flooding his mouth, though there was no salt anywhere in the building. Recovery Girl had found nothing wrong with him. All night, watching the footage afterward with the particular stillness he reserved for things that frightened him, had said nothing wrong with him either, though his eyes had not agreed with his mouth. It was the second incident, 4 days later in the school's training pool during a routine rescue drill, that had brought him here, to this ward, to this glass, to these technicians who would not look at him directly anymore. He had only meant to swim to the bottom and retrieve a simulated victim. The pool was 4 meters deep. He had done the same drill a dozen times without incident. But the moment the water closed over his head this time, something in his chest had simply let go, the way a fist releases after being clenched for years without the person ever realizing they were clenching it, and Izuku had felt himself expand. Bone had become something other than bone. His spine had elongated, and the elongation had not hurt, had in fact felt like the correction of an old, unacknowledged ache, like a limb finally permitted to stretch after a lifetime folded into too small a space. Scales the color of deep-sea pressure, blacks shading into bruised violets and the cold green of light at the bottom of trenches no sun had ever reached, had risen across skin that no longer quite remembered being skin. He had grown until the training pool, an Olympic facility built to hero course specifications, could not contain him, until the reinforced walls had groaned and then simply stopped existing as walls, dissolving outward in a silent eruption of water and concrete dust that the cameras had captured from 9 different angles and that the administration had spent the following 3 days trying to delete from every server in the building. He remembered very little of being that shape. He remembered pressure, and depth, and a strange, sourceless certainty that he was finally, for the first time in his life, exactly the right size. He remembered surfacing in the wreckage of the pool to the screaming of evacuated students and the white, stricken faces of 3 pro heroes who had each taken an instinctive step backward before catching themselves, and he remembered the way Aizawa's capturing weapon had hung loose and useless in his hand, because there was no length of fabric in that man's considerable arsenal that could have wrapped around what Izuku had become. By the time he returned to his own body, lying naked and shivering in 4 inches of standing water with broken tile under his palms, the decision had already been made above him, in offices he wasn't invited into. He understood that without being told. He had always been good at understanding the things adults decided not to say out loud. So now he sat in the ward, watching the 2 technicians outside the glass, and tried to read their lips, and found that he could, with a clarity that should have unsettled him more than it did. Containment classification pending, one of them was saying. Until commission review. The other one, older, with the kind of permanent stoop that came from decades hunched over instruments instead of people, did not look convinced. He thinks we should isolate him further. Pull him from coursework entirely. Optics. Optics, Izuku thought. Not safety. Not his well-being. Optics. He had spent his whole life chasing the right to stand among heroes, had broken his own bones doing it, had bled for a system that promised if you tried hard enough and cared enough it would eventually let you in. He had believed that promise with the kind of totality that only the truly desperate or the truly young could manage, and he had been both. The door opened. It was not Aizawa, and it was not All Might. It was a representative from the Hero Public Safety Commission, a narrow man in an expensive suit whose name Izuku did not bother to retain, because he understood within 4 sentences that the man had not come to ask how Izuku was feeling. We need to discuss containment protocols, the man said, setting a tablet on the table between them with the deliberate care of someone defusing something. Given the scale of the manifestation, the Commission has concerns about continued enrollment. There are precedents. Quirks that exceed certain thresholds of collateral risk have historically required either suppressor implementation or relocation to a specialized facility. We want to explore options that protect everyone, including you. Izuku looked at the tablet. He did not pick it up. Including me, he repeated. Of course. What does protecting me look like, he asked, in your version of this? The man's smile did not reach the rest of his face. There are facilities. Comfortable ones. Where a quirk of this magnitude could be studied properly, and where you would be safe from public exposure until we better understand the parameters. Studied, Izuku said. Supported, the man corrected smoothly. The wording matters less than the outcome. We are talking about a containment field roughly the size of a stadium, Midoriya. We are talking about a transformation that, unmonitored, could level a city block in either direction. You understand why this requires structure. Izuku thought about the 8 years he had spent being told he could never be a hero because he had nothing inside him worth protecting. He thought about the year and a half since, climbing toward worth through every broken bone, every scream that tore his throat raw, every night he iced his hands until they went numb because numb was better than feeling exactly how much further he had left to climb. He thought about the way the entire system had simply waited, patient as a glacier, for him to finally become powerful enough to be useful, and how the very first thing it had offered him for that power was a cage with better lighting. I'd like to see Principal Nizu, Izuku said. That may not be possible today. I'd like to see All Might, Izuku tried. All Might's recommendation, the man said, with the faint, satisfied weight of someone laying down a card he had been holding all along, was actually one of the most conservative options on the table. That landed somewhere under Izuku's ribs, exactly where the thing that was not bone anymore had first opened its eye. He kept his face still. He had learned, over a year and a half of training under a man who flinched at nothing, how to keep his face still. I'd like some time, he said instead. To think. The man gathered the tablet, satisfied, mistaking silence for capitulation the way men in expensive suits so often did. Of course. Take the evening. We will reconvene tomorrow morning. He left. Izuku sat in the small gray room for a long time after the door clicked shut, listening to the ventilation hum, and somewhere beneath that hum, fainter than thought, he could hear water moving through the building's pipes, dozens of meters of it, threading through walls and under floors, patient, plentiful, waiting. He had spent his whole life being told he was not enough. Now, for the first time, he understood that the problem had never been a shortage. It had been an audience that could not survive the surplus. That night he did not sleep in the dormitory bed they had assigned him under quiet, watchful supervision. He sat by the window of his temporary room, looking out over the dark sprawl of the school grounds toward the distant black line of the bay, and he thought about cages with good lighting, and stadiums built to contain him, and a recommendation made by the only man who had ever told him he could be a hero, made now, apparently, in the spirit of containment rather than encouragement. He thought about Achiko's face when she heard, and Ida's careful diplomacy, and Bakugo's incandescent fury directed at exactly the wrong target because Bakugo always burned hottest when he was frightened and had nowhere to point it. He thought about all of it with the strange, hollowed calm of someone already 3 steps further down a road than the people trying to plan his next step for him. Near midnight, he opened the window. The bay was 4 kilometers away by road. It was considerably less than that as the water moved, if a person knew how to listen for it, and Izuku had discovered over the last 4 days that he knew how to listen for almost nothing else. He climbed out into the dark, and he did not look back at the dormitory, and by the time security realized the room was empty the trail of displaced grass and broken fence slats led in one direction only, toward the sea, and stopped existing entirely at the Titiline, where the only remaining evidence was a depression in the wet sand large enough to have held a building, and a retreating wake that curved out toward open water and did not curve back. Chapter 2. The first 100 meters of true depth taught him more about himself than 16 years on land ever had. Light went first, the easy gold of surface sun fracturing into blue and then into a deep, bruised indigo and then into nothing at all, and Izuku found that the nothing did not frighten him, because the moment darkness closed over him completely, his body answered it. Something along his flank lit with a slow bioluminescent pulse, blue-white, patterned like the underside of a wave caught in moonlight, and where the light fell across the water he could see, not with eyes exactly, but with something wider and older that read pressure and current and the shape of the dark the way a hand reads a wall in an unlit room. He was enormous. He understood this distantly, as a fact rather than a feeling, the way a person understands the size of a house they have lived in their whole life without ever needing to measure it. His new shape moved through the water with a slow, devastating grace that the old shape, the human one, had never possessed and had spent a year and a half of brutal training only ever approximating. Plates of something like bone, blue-black and faintly luminous at the seams, ridged down a spine longer than the training pool that had failed to hold him. Limbs that were not quite limbs anymore, fins and the suggestion of clawed digits beneath them, capable of both impossible speed and a stillness so total that schools of fish drifted past him as though he were an outcropping of the seabed itself. He sank for what felt like hours. The thermocline passed over him like a curtain, the water shifting from the last residual warmth of the sun-touched layer into something colder, older, indifferent. Pressure that would have folded a submarine like wet paper simply settled against his new bones as a kind of pleasant weight, a blanket rather than a threat. He understood, somewhere in the patient old thing now fully awake behind his ribs, that he had not gained a quirk so much as remembered one, that something in his blood had always belonged down here and had simply waited an entire childhood of bullying and a year and a half of broken bones for the rest of him to catch up. There is a version of this story where Izuku Midoriya wept for what he had lost. He did not. He descended, and the descending felt like exhaling after holding a breath for 16 years, and the deeper he went the more he found himself, ironically, thinking with absolute clarity for the first time since the diagnostic ward, since the man in the expensive suit, since the calm, satisfied weight of All Might's name attached to the word containment. He thought about heroism the way he had been taught it. A smile and a thumbs up. Save who you can reach, photograph well doing it, let the agency handle the optics afterward. He thought about Endeavor's decades of violence laundered into a #1 ranking by a public that had decided not to look too closely as long as the burning buildings kept getting put out. He thought about the eerie, bureaucratic calm of the man with the tablet, discussing stadium-sized containment fields the way another man might discuss zoning permits. He thought about a system that had spent his entire life insisting that strength without the right paperwork was a threat, and strength with the right paperwork was a hero, and had never once, in any of its insistence, asked what the strength actually wanted. He kept descending. The seabed found him before he found it, an immense dark plain stretching beyond the reach of even his strange new vision, broken by ridges and the black mouths of trenches that breathed cold currents up from depths he had not yet explored. Coral did not grow here. The pressure was too great, the temperature too cold, the dark too absolute for anything that depended on sunlight. And yet the seabed was not empty. He could feel, through some sense he had no name for, vast slow shapes moving at the edges of his awareness, ancient things that had never needed names because no surface fisherman had ever survived long enough to encounter them and tell the story. They did not flee from him. He found that curious, and then he understood why, because the moment he settled onto the seabed, claws the size of city buses sinking gently into silt that had not been disturbed in centuries, every one of those vast slow shapes turned, as one, to face him. They were not afraid. They were waiting. He felt it arrive in him the way a key fits a lock it has never seen before but was always cut for, an old recognition flooding upward from the silt itself, from the ancient pressure, from the patient dark. Sovereign. The word was not spoken. Nothing down here spoke in the way the surface understood speaking. But the meaning arrived anyway, total and unmistakable, the way the meaning of a tide arrives in the body of anyone standing in it. He had spent 16 years being told, gently and not so gently, that he did not belong. He had spent a year and a half being told that belonging was something you earned through sanctioned violence performed under the supervision of men who profited from your bruises. He had spent 4 days being told that his belonging now required a stadium with reinforced walls and a recommendation from the one man he had trusted most, filed cheerfully under the heading of containment. Here, in the dark, in the cold, in the silence beneath every surface that had ever measured him and found him either insufficient or excessive, something ancient and patient had simply been waiting for him to arrive, and had no questions about whether he belonged. I am not going back, Izuku thought, and felt the thought settle through the water around him like a stone finding the bottom of a well. Then build, something answered, not in words, but in the pressure of the abyss itself, the ancient slow creatures, the cold currents, the silt undisturbed by light. Build, and we will hold what you build. Chapter 3. He did not return to the surface for 3 weeks. In that time, the story above the waterline grew the way stories always grow in the absence of facts, filling the empty spaces with whatever shape served the teller best. Some reports called it a containment failure and quietly buried the footage. Others, leaked through channels the commission could not fully seal, called it something closer to the truth, that a 16-year-old UA student with the single greatest collateral risk quirk on record had been informed of his impending institutionalization and had walked into the sea rather than submit to it, and that the agencies tasked with finding him again had, after 3 weeks, found nothing but cold water and silence. Below, Izuku built. He discovered, in those 3 weeks, that his new body was not simply armor and scale and bioluminescent light. It was also tool, in ways the old human hands had never been. Claws that could shape stone the way a sculptor's chisel shaped marble, except faster, except with a strength that turned bedrock pliable in passes that would have taken human engineering crews years. He found a basin perhaps 30 kilometers from where he had first descended, a vast natural depression in the ocean floor ringed by undersea ridges like the walls of an ancient amphitheater, fed by warm vents that bled mineral-rich water up from somewhere far beneath the crust, warm enough at the basin floor to support life that the surrounding cold seabed could not. He began, without entirely understanding why, to carve towers first, instinctively, because some old animal part of him understood that height meant visibility meant safety meant home, towers of black coral stone fused under pressure into something stronger than concrete, rising from the basin floor in slow, patient spirals that mirrored, though he did not consciously intend it, the spiral of a shell. Then walls, lower, broader, ringing the warm vent gardens where strange luminous plant analogues had already begun to bloom in colors no surface botanist had ever catalogued, blooming faster than any surface garden because the volcanic warmth and mineral wealth of the vents fed them in a way sunlight never could. The ancient creatures came, slowly, in the way that ancient things always move slowly toward change even when they have already decided to embrace it. A leviathan something like a kraken but vastly larger, its mantle alone wider than a city block, settled into the basin's deepest trench and did not leave again, content, it seemed, simply to watch the towers rise. Schools of fish that had never known a predator larger than themselves began circling the warm vent gardens in slow, glittering loops, drawn by light and warmth and the strange safety of the sovereign's presence. Things with no surface names, things that belonged to depths no submersible had ever photographed, drifted closer over the course of days, watching the construction with what Izuku, increasingly, understood as something like hope. He did not eat the way he once had. He found that the abyss itself sustained him in ways he did not fully understand and did not feel urgently compelled to interrogate, some new metabolism running on pressure and mineral water and the simple, total rightness of finally occupying a body that fit. He slept in fragments, curled around the base of the tallest spire he had raised, and when he slept he dreamed in pressure and current rather than pictures, dreams he could not have described to a surface psychologist even if one had been foolish enough to follow him down. On the 19th day, he found language for what he was building, though no one was present to hear him say it. He had surfaced briefly, only his eye and the crown of his head breaching into starlight far from any shipping lane, to taste the difference between surface air and the water he had grown to prefer, and in that brief moment of cold night air on wet bone, he thought, with total clarity, a kingdom. Not a containment facility. Not a stadium. Not a cage with good lighting administered by men in suits who used the word supported to mean monitored. A kingdom, built by him, for things the surface had decided were either too dangerous or too inconvenient to matter, sustained by a sea that asked nothing of him except that he exist within it honestly, the way it had never once, in 3 weeks, asked him to apologize for his own size. He sank back beneath the surface and did not look toward land again. By the 21st day, the basin he had chosen was no longer a basin. It was a city, dark and vast and strange and growing, its towers catching the thin blue light that managed to filter down from a sun 400 meters above, its warm vent gardens blooming in luminous colors, its ancient guardians settled into a slow, patient orbit around a sovereign who had never asked to be one, and who was beginning, despite himself, to understand that he might actually want to be. He had no name for the city yet. He did not feel any urgency about choosing one. Names, he had learned in his old life, were the sort of thing the surface obsessed over because the surface needed labels to sort its hierarchies. Down here, in the patient dark, the city did not need a name to be real. It only needed time and water, and a sovereign willing to keep building. He had all three. Chapter 4. The surface, in those same 3 weeks, did not stop moving simply because Izuku had. Ryukyu had not slept properly since the night UA quietly informed her agency that one of its first years had a quirk classification pending review and then, 4 days later, informed her again, less quietly this time, that the same student had vanished into the Pacific and left no trail any rescue diver, sonar sweep, or trained quirk tracker had been able to follow past the first 100 meters of depth. She had taken Tatsuma's intern program seriously from the day she accepted her first sidekick. She remembered Midoriya's diligence with a clarity that surprised her, given how briefly their paths had crossed, an analytical mind that asked better questions than most third-year hero course students, a body that pushed itself past sound medical advice in pursuit of margins other people considered acceptable losses, and underneath all of it, a kind of unselfish hunger to be useful that she recognized because she had spent her own adolescence cultivating the same hunger in herself. She had not been surprised that he manifested something enormous. People who carried that much pressure inward for that long, she had learned over a long hero career, tended to eventually need somewhere for the pressure to go. She had been surprised, and then quietly, privately furious, at the contents of the leaked containment memo that named her own dragon form, in passing, as evidence for the kind of precedent the Commission intended to set. If a heteromorphic transformation quirk of significant scale could be permitted to operate freely within agency structure, the memo's authors had written, with the particular bloodless confidence of men who had never once transformed into anything, then the precedent invited public confusion regarding which large-scale quirks required containment and which did not. Midoriya's case, by contrast, presented none of the institutional safeguards that made Ryukyu's own dragon form publicly palatable. Publicly palatable. She had read that phrase perhaps 11 times since the memo reached her, and on the 11th reading she had set her tea down with enough force to crack the cup, because she understood, with the particular clarity of someone the system had spent a career grudgingly tolerating rather than ever fully embracing, exactly what the memo actually meant. It meant that her own monstrous shape had been permitted because it served the agency's profitable, marketable, leashed. It meant that Izuku's identical impulse, the same animal need to become something large enough that the world could no longer overlook it, had been judged differently only because no one had yet found a way to put his face on merchandise. She did not blame the boy for vanishing. If anything, in the privacy of her own apartment, staring at a ceiling she had stopped expecting sleep to find her under, she found herself wondering what would have happened if she had vanished too, all those years ago, the first time someone in a commission office referred to her own scales as a liability requiring management. Sirius had asked her, 3 days into the search efforts, whether she thought the boy was dead. No, Ryukyu had said, with a certainty she had not examined closely enough to justify. He's not dead. He's somewhere the rest of us simply haven't learned to look yet. Sirius, for her part, had grown up on boats before she grew up anywhere else, raised in a coastal fishing town by parents who treated the ocean the way other families treated weather, a constant, indifferent presence to be respected rather than feared. Her star-shard quirk, the bioluminescent constellation patterns that bloomed across her skin and could be weaponized into searing, concentrated light, had manifested early, in deep water during a childhood swim, and she had spent her adolescence understanding, long before any agency offered her a hero license, that the sea did not care about a person's classification paperwork. It simply asked whether you respected it enough to survive it. She had joined Ryukyu's agency 3 years ago specifically because Ryukyu was one of the only senior heroes in the country willing to deploy aquatic rescue operations as a primary specialty rather than a curiosity, and in 3 years of working alongside her, Sirius had come to understand something the wider hero rankings consistently failed to grasp, that water rescue was its own discipline, with its own physics, its own patience, its own humility, and that heroes who treated the sea as simply another backdrop for punching villains tended, with grim regularity, to drown. She had not met Midoriya more than twice, both times briefly, both times during joint training exercises where his obsessive, muttering analysis of every hero's quirk mechanics had struck her as faintly absurd and faintly endearing in roughly equal measure. She remembered, mostly, the way he had apologized to a training dummy after accidentally breaking its arm during a rescue drill, a small, automatic, sincere apology offered to an object that could not hear it, the kind of reflexive decency that either meant a person had been raised by someone extraordinary or had simply decided, against every incentive the world offered otherwise, to be extraordinary themselves. She did not think he was dead either. She thought, increasingly, watching the surface search efforts wind down into the bureaucratic shuffle of cases quietly reclassified as low priority, that the ocean had taken him in the way the ocean sometimes took people who had nowhere left on land willing to hold them properly, and that whatever he had become down there, it was no longer entirely the surface world's business. She did not know, watching the gray Pacific horizon from the deck of Ryukyu's agency's response vessel on the morning of the 22nd day, how soon that distance between his business and the surface's business would collapse entirely, and how violently. The first sign was barometric. The agency's meteorological liaison flagged an irregularity in the pressure readings 40 kilometers off the coast, a localized anomaly too small to register as a storm system and too strange in its formation to be dismissed as instrument error, a tight, almost perfectly circular depression in atmospheric pressure sitting directly above water that should not, by any model the liaison trusted, have produced anything of the kind. Ryukyu studied the readings for a long time without speaking. "That's not weather," she finally said. "No," Sirius agreed, watching the same number scroll past on a secondary monitor with the kind of stillness her childhood on fishing boats had taught her to reserve for exactly this feeling, the one that arrived just before something large changed the water without yet showing itself. "That's something underneath, breathing." Chapter 5. The villains came from the south 3 hours later, and for a long time afterward, in the after-action reports that several different agencies would file and several different officials would quietly bury, no one could fully agree on what they had actually been trying to accomplish. The official designation, eventually, was the Tidebreaker incident, named for the lead villain, a broad-shouldered man with a quirk that let him generate and direct localized tsunamis from a fixed point, provided he had enough open water and enough time to build the wave's momentum. He had assembled, over the preceding months, a loose coalition of 6 other villains with water-adjacent or coastal disruption quirks, a coalition held together less by ideology than by simple opportunism, the recognition that the nation's coastal cities, for all their hero coverage on land, remained chronically under-defended against attacks that came from the water itself. Their target was a coastal energy platform 14 kilometers offshore, an experimental facility drawing power from deep ocean thermal vents, a target chosen, the eventual investigation would conclude, less for ideological reasons than for the platform's isolation, the slow hero response time to open water, and the simple fact that crippling it would black out 3 separate coastal districts and create exactly the kind of visible, photographable chaos that villain coalitions of this particular opportunistic stripe tended to crave. Ryukyu's agency vessel was the closest hero asset when the attack began, which was less a stroke of luck than a consequence of 3 weeks spent searching open water for a missing student and finding, instead, an early warning system for exactly the kind of maritime threat the nation's hero infrastructure had never seriously prepared for. The platform's distress signal came in raw and immediate. Tidebreaker himself stood on the platform's lower deck, both arms raised, dragging a wave up out of calm water with the slow, terrible patience of a conductor building toward a climax, a wave that the platform's engineers, watching from the upper levels, estimated even in its early formation at over 15 meters and climbing. Ryukyu transformed before the response vessel had even fully closed the distance, her dragon form unfurling into the gray morning sky in a long arc of pale scale and storm-colored wing. diving directly toward Tiebreaker's position with the simple intention of disrupting his concentration before the wave reached full height. Sirius went into the water from the vessel's deck without waiting for authorization, her skin already lit in the slow, spreading constellation pattern that meant she was preparing to use her light at full output, swimming toward the platform's support pylons where two of the coalition's other members, a woman who could superheat water into scalding steam clouds and a man who could turn seawater into a corrosive brine capable of eating through standard marine-grade steel, were working in tandem to collapse the platform's southern leg. It did not go well, not at first. Tiebreaker's wave, even half disrupted by Ryukyu's dive, struck the platform's lower deck with enough force to fold steel railing like wet cardboard, and the secondary explosion when seawater met an exposed power conduit sent a column of white fire 40 meters into the gray sky, visible, the after-action report would later note, from the coastline itself, where civilians had already begun filming. Ryukyu took the second wave directly, a smaller one but launched at closer range, with less warning, by a coalition member whose quirk she had not been briefed on and had no time to analyze before 3,000 gallons of compressed seawater struck her dragon form mid-dive and drove her down into the platform's collapsing support structure hard enough to crack two of the heavy stabilizing struts she landed across. Sirius, in the water below, watched the corrosive brine eat through the southern support pylon in real time, watched the platform's entire structure begin the slow, grinding lean that meant total structural failure was now a matter of seconds rather than minutes, and understood, with the particular cold clarity of someone who had spent her childhood reading water for exactly this kind of warning, that the platform was going into the sea, that Ryukyu was pinned beneath several tons of collapsing steel in a body too large to easily extract from a confined wreck, and that she herself had perhaps 4 seconds to decide whether to attempt a rescue that every part of her training told her she did not have the physical strength to complete. She swam toward Ryukyu anyway, because that was the only decision Sirius had ever known how to make. The platform's southern half went into the ocean 11 seconds later, an avalanche of steel and burning fuel and white water descending into the open sea with a violence that the surface witnesses, watching from the safety of the coastline, would later describe as the worst thing they had ever seen a human being attempt to swim toward. Sirius did not reach Ryukyu before the wreckage closed over both of them. For 6 full seconds, the response vessel's crew, the coastline's horrified witnesses, and the 3 remaining coalition villains still operating on the platform's collapsing northern half all watched the same patch of white, churning water and saw no sign of either hero resurface. Then the water began to glow. Not the pale blue-white of Sirius's constellation light, though that color was present too, flickering weakly from somewhere beneath the wreckage like a signal fire fighting to stay lit in a flood. This was something else entirely, a vast, slow, ancient blue-green luminescence rising from beneath the sinking platform itself, spreading outward through the water in concentric rings exactly the way light spreads through water disturbed by something enormous, surfacing, from very far below. The sea around the wreck site did not simply ripple. It rose. Steel that had been sinking reversed direction. Sections of the platform's northern half, still occupied by the 3 remaining coalition villains, tilted at an angle that made no hydrodynamic sense, lifted not by buoyancy but by something moving directly beneath them with enough mass to displace an ocean liner's worth of water without visible effort. Tiebreaker, still clinging to a railing on the platform's upper deck, looked down into water that had begun to glow from beneath like the floor of the sea itself had caught fire with something cold and blue, and for the first time in a villain career built almost entirely on confidence, his face went the particular gray color of a man recalculating every assumption he had ever made about what the ocean could contain. Something breached. It did not breach the way a whale breaches, fast and arcing and gone again in a spray of white water. It rose the way a mountain might rise if mountains had patience, slow and total and undeniable, water sheeting off scales the color of pressure and depth in sheets that themselves looked less like water than like something shedding an old skin, revealing beneath it a shape that the platform's remaining survivors, in their scattered, contradicting testimonies later collected by investigators, would each individually struggle to describe with any consistency, because the human eye, evolved entirely on land, had simply never needed language for a creature this size moving with this much controlled, deliberate grace. It was larger than the platform. It was larger, several witnesses would later insist independently of one another, than seemed physically reasonable for any organism to be without collapsing under its own structural weight, though none of them could explain why it clearly was not collapsing, why it moved instead with the eerie, unbothered ease of something entirely at home in a medium that should have crushed it. Bioluminescent patterns traced down a spine longer than the wrecked platform's full original length, blue-white light pulsing in slow, deliberate rhythm, like breathing, like a heartbeat made visible. Where the light caught the creature's eyes, and the eyes were the first thing that made Tidebreaker understand, with total animal certainty, that he had made the worst tactical decision of his entire criminal career, there was something in them that was not animal hunger and was not even quite animal anger. It was recognition. Aimed, with terrible specificity, directly at him. The creature's claw closed around the platform's collapsing northern section the way a person might close a hand around a teacup, not crushing it, simply containing it, simply stopping its fall, and at the same moment, beneath the water, a second movement, smaller, faster, deliberate, swept upward and caught two unconscious shapes in a gentle current that pulled them clear of the wreckage and toward the surface with a tenderness that contrasted with almost violent absurdity against the creature's overwhelming scale. Ryukyu broke the surface first, coughing seawater, her dragon form bleeding from several deep gashes along her flank but alive, lifted clear of the sinking wreckage by a current that felt, impossibly, deliberate, guided, careful, the way a parent might cup water in their hands to carry something fragile without crushing it. Sirius surfaced a half-second later, gasping, her constellation patterns flaring bright with the automatic reflex of fear and survival, and the first thing she saw, breaking the surface into the gray morning light, was the creature's eye, vast and ancient and lit from within with that same patient blue-green glow, fixed not on her, not yet, but on the three remaining coalition villains scrambling toward the platform's last intact lifeboat with the particular desperate speed of men who had just watched their entire understanding of the ocean's contents become catastrophically, irreversibly obsolete. It did not chase them immediately. It simply watched them flee, with an expression that Sirius, treading water 20 meters from a creature the size of a city block, found she could read with unsettling clarity even on a face built from scale and bone and bioluminescent light that bore no resemblance to anything human. It was not mercy. It was the particular patience of something that understood it would never need to chase anything again, because nothing in this ocean would ever again be able to outrun it. Then, slowly, the vast head turned, and the ancient eye settled on Sirius, and on Ryukyu beside her, bleeding into water that the creature's own glow had turned the color of deep twilight, and a voice arrived, not through the water exactly, not through the air exactly, but through both at once, low and resonant and unmistakably, impossibly familiar. "You're hurt," the voice said, and underneath the alien register of it, underneath 16 years of bone and scale that no longer matched the shape it had been built from, Sirius heard something that made her breath catch harder than the wreck or the wave or the fall ever had. She heard a boy's voice, the one she remembered apologizing to a training dummy, asking with the same automatic, helpless decency whether two strangers he had just pulled from a collapsing platform were going to be all right. "Midoriya," Ryukyu said, her voice cracking on the name, equal parts disbelief and something that, were she being honest with herself later, she would have to admit was relief so total it nearly undid her composure entirely. The vast head lowered, slow, deliberate, until one ancient eye hovered close enough to the water's surface that Sirius could see her own faint reflection in it, distorted, dwarfed, and entirely, strangely unafraid. "Not anymore," the voice said. "Not by that name. Not to them." Chapter 6. The platform finished sinking 11 minutes later, its last support structure giving way with a groan that echoed across open water long after the structure itself had vanished beneath the surface, and by then it no longer mattered to anyone watching, because every camera angle, every drone feed, every coastline witness's phone recording had already abandoned the platform entirely in favor of the thing that had risen beside it. Izuku did not return to his full colossal scale once the immediate danger passed. He found, with some interested surprise, that the shape was not fixed the way he had assumed during those first disorienting days underwater, that some deep instinctual control allowed him to settle toward something marginally less overwhelming, still vast, still scaled, still lit along his spine with that slow bioluminescent pulse, but compact enough that he no longer dwarfed the horizon, more sea serpent now than living mountain, coiled in slow loops around the wreckage site while Ryukyu and Sirius were pulled aboard the response vessel by a crew too stunned to process what they were witnessing in real time. He did not follow the vessel back toward the coastline. He understood, with a clarity that surprised him given how recently he had abandoned the surface entirely, that appearing in full view of a coastal city in this shape would accomplish nothing except recreating, on a much larger scale, the exact panic and containment hysteria that had driven him into the ocean in the first place. Instead he waited, coiled at a respectful distance, until the response vessel slowed, until medical personnel began working on Ryukyu's gashes and Sirius's exhaustion on the open deck, and only then did he allow himself to surface again, head and the first several meters of his serpentine length breaching close enough to the vessel's railing that Ryukyu, bandaged and sitting upright against the medical crew's protests, could see him clearly without needing binoculars. "You shouldn't be sitting up," the voice said, threading through air and water both with that same strange dual resonance, and underneath the alien register, Ryukyu could hear something achingly familiar, the same reflexive concern that had once made a first-year student double-check, 3 separate times, that none of the rescue dummies and a training exercise had been damaged before he would agree to end the drill. "I've had worse," Ryukyu said, which was true, and also entirely beside the point. "You almost weren't pulled out in time," the voice said, and for the first time, the dual resonance carried something rawer underneath the careful calm, something that sounded, Ryukyu thought, disconcertingly like fear remembered rather than fear present. "I felt the platform start to go and I wasn't close enough yet. I wasn't fast enough." "You were fast enough," Sirius said, sitting up despite the exhaustion still pulling at every muscle in her body, her voice carrying clearly across the water with the particular bluntness of someone raised on fishing boats who had never developed much patience for false modesty, whether her own or anyone else's. "We're alive. You were fast enough." The vast eye turned toward her, and something in its ancient blue-green depths seemed, briefly, almost startled, as though he had not expected to be contradicted, or perhaps had not expected anyone on the surface to bother. 3 weeks, Ryukyu said, before the silence could stretch too long. 3 weeks the entire Eastern Search Command had nothing. Not a sonar ping, not a debris trail, nothing. And the first time anyone finds you, it's because you just stopped an entire coastal platform from killing 40 engineers and 2 heroes who had no business surviving that wreck without help. "I wasn't hiding from a rescue," Izuku said, and the careful calm returned to his voice, settling over the rawer thing beneath it the way water settles after a stone's impact. "I was hiding from a stadium." Ryukyu went very still. Sirius, watching her captain's face, recognized the particular stillness of someone receiving confirmation of something they had already privately suspected and had not wanted to be right about. "The containment memo," Ryukyu said. "You saw it." "I saw all of it," Izuku said. "Every memo. Every meeting they didn't think I could hear through 3 floors of concrete and 4 locked doors. I heard the word supported used to mean monitored, and I heard the word optics used instead of the word safety, and I heard a recommendation with All Might's name on it that amounted to the same cage everyone else wanted, just dressed up gently because it was him saying it instead of someone I trusted less." Sirius said nothing, because she had read the same memo, second-hand, leaked through channels that should never have let it travel as far as it had, and she had already privately concluded, days before this moment, that she did not entirely blame the boy in front of her for whatever decision he had made in response. "So you built something else," Ryukyu said. It wasn't a question. "I'm still building it," Izuku said. "There's a city down there. It doesn't have a name yet. It has towers and warm water gardens and creatures the surface has never photographed because the surface never survives long enough at the depths where they live, and none of them have ever once asked me to apologize for taking up space." The response vessel's deck had gone quiet, the medical crew having retreated several steps without anyone quite deciding to order them to, leaving Ryukyu and Sirius at the railing with a creature the length of a city block coiled patiently in the water below them, waiting. Ryukyu understood slowly, not for an order, and not even quite for an answer. Waiting to see what they would choose to do with what he had just told them. "Why tell us this?" Ryukyu said. "You could have pulled us out and vanished again. You could have let us go on thinking you drowned, or thinking you were dead, or thinking whatever story the commission decided to tell the public to close the file. Why surface? Why speak? Why risk us reporting every word of this back to the people who already tried to put you in a stadium? Because you're the only two people on the surface, Izuku said, slowly, as though testing the shape of the realization even as he spoke it aloud for the first time, who I watched try to do this job honestly. I watched you take rescue assignments other agencies wrote off as too costly for too little publicity. I watched her, he said, the ancient eye shifting briefly toward Sirius, train herself half to exhaustion every week because she refused to let open water be the reason someone's family didn't get them back. I watched the memo call your own dragon form a managed liability in the same paragraph where it called mine an unmanageable threat, and the only difference between those two judgments that I could find anywhere in the document was which of you the agencies had already learned how to profit from. Sirius felt something tighten in her chest that was not quite anger and was not quite grief but sat uncomfortably close to both. You're not wrong, she said quietly. I know I'm not, Izuku said. That's the part that took me 3 weeks to fully understand. I'm not wrong, and neither of you are dangerous, and none of that mattered to a single person in that office, because the document was never actually about danger. It was about which kind of large, frightening thing could still be sold as a product. The vessel rocked gently on a swell that had nothing to do with him, the storm of the morning's attack having long since passed, leaving behind only gray water and a sky beginning, faintly, to clear. I'm not asking you to come with me, Izuku said, after a long moment, and something in his voice had gone careful again, deliberately so, the tone of someone choosing each word with the precision of a person who understood exactly how much weight the next sentence might carry. I'm asking you to think about what it would mean if you did. Not today. Not on a deck with your wounds still wet and your agency's recovery boat 20 minutes out. But sometime. When you've had time to decide for yourselves whether the surface is still where you want to spend whatever's left of your careers, fighting for recognition from people who already decided what you're worth before you ever opened your mouths. He began, slowly, to sink, the bioluminescent length of him sliding back beneath the surface in unhurried coils, and Ryukyu found herself gripping the railing hard enough that her knuckles paled, not from fear, but from the strange, vertiginous sensation of watching someone she had once mentored, however briefly, choose an entirely different ocean to belong to and extend, without quite asking, the possibility that she might belong there too. How do we find you, she called out, before the last curve of him vanished beneath the waterline, if we decide we want to. The voice that answered came from somewhere already below the surface, distant, resonant, carrying the faintest trace of something that might, in a boy who still remembered how to smile, have been warmth. You won't have to find me, it said. The water will already know where I am. You'll only have to ask it. Then the sea closed over him entirely, and the gray morning settled back into ordinary stillness, broken only by the distant wail of a recovery vessel finally arriving 20 minutes too late to do anything except confirm, on official record, that the platform was gone, that both heroes had survived against every reasonable expectation, and that whatever had pulled them from the wreckage had already vanished back into water no sonar on the recovery vessel's hull could meaningfully track. Ryukyu did not move from the railing for a long time. Captain, Sirius said eventually, quiet enough that the retreating medical crew would not overhear. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, Ryukyu said slowly, that I just spent 3 weeks searching for a missing student, and I never once considered that the reason we couldn't find him was that he had already built somewhere better than anything we were planning to bring him back to. Sirius looked down at the water, gray and ordinary and giving away nothing now, no glow, no shape, no sign that anything larger than a fish moved beneath it. So what do we do? She asked. Ryukyu was quiet for a long moment, watching the same unremarkable water, feeling the ache of her healing wounds and the deeper, less locatable ache of a memo that had called her own scales a managed liability, and finally she said, with the particular careful honesty of someone choosing not to lie to herself even when a comfortable lie was readily available. I don't know yet. But I don't think I want to pretend the question isn't real. The recovery vessel pulled alongside 20 minutes later, full of apologies and questions neither hero felt prepared to answer honestly, and the official report filed that evening would describe an unidentified aquatic entity of significant scale that had assisted in the rescue of 2 heroes during the tidebreaker incident before returning to unknown depths, location and nature presently unconfirmed. It would not mention a name. Ryukyu made sure of that herself, striking the single line from the draft report where a junior officer had written, with more accuracy than the commission would ever be comfortable acknowledging, suspected connection to missing UA student Midoriya, Izuku, pending further investigation. She struck it not because she intended to hide the truth forever. She struck it because, for the first time since the memo had landed on her desk, she found herself genuinely uncertain whether the truth, once surfaced, would be used to bring a boy home, or simply to build a larger cage. And until she knew which, she decided, watching the gray water slide past the hull on the long return to harbor, she would rather the surface kept wondering. Chapter 7. The Commission's debrief took place 4 days after the tidebreaker incident, in a conference room on the 11th floor of a building Ryukyu had visited perhaps a dozen times in her career and had never once enjoyed visiting. She had requested Sirius be present for the debrief, partly because Sirius had been in the water and her account mattered, and partly because Ryukyu had learned, over a long career of being managed by people who preferred to manage her alone, that witnesses changed the tenor of a room even when they said almost nothing. The man running the debrief was not the same narrow man in the expensive suit who had visited Izuku's diagnostic ward, though Ryukyu would not learn that detail until much later. This one was older, heavier, with the particular weary authority of someone who had spent decades turning disasters into manageable paragraphs. His name was Director Sakaki, and he had a folder in front of him that Ryukyu suspected, correctly, contained transcripts of every word she and Sirius had spoken on that response vessel's deck, gathered from a recovery crew that had clearly been less stunned and less inattentive than they had appeared. "Let's begin with the entity," Sakaki said, without preamble, sliding 2 photographs across the table, blurred long lens shots taken from the coastline, useless for anything except confirming scale. "Your report describes an unidentified aquatic organism of significant size that assisted in your extraction from the wreck. I'd like you to walk me through that description again, because I have to tell you, Captain Ryukyu, I find it strange that an organism large enough to lift a collapsing oil platform with one limb left such an incomplete account in your official filing." "I described what I saw," Ryukyu said. "Large. Bioluminescent. Intelligent enough to extract 2 unconscious heroes from a wreck with precision rather than force. I don't know what else you'd like added." Sakaki did not look at the folder. He did not need to. "I'd like the identity added, Captain. The one your junior officer attempted to include before you struck it from the draft." The room went very still. Sirius, sitting beside Ryukyu with her hands folded carefully on the table, felt the particular cold drop in her stomach that came from watching someone else's lie about to be exposed when she had agreed, without ever quite saying so aloud, to be complicit in it. "I struck a speculative line," Ryukyu said, her voice even, controlled, the voice of someone who had given enough depositions in her career to know exactly how much weight each word would carry. The officer in question had no confirmed basis for the identification beyond timing and scale. "I did not consider unverified speculation appropriate for an official incident report." "You don't believe it was Midoriya?" "I believe an official report should contain verified facts," Ryukyu said, "and not the first theory a stressed and underslept junior officer reaches for at 2 in the morning while writing up the worst incident of his career so far." Sakaki studied her for a long moment, and Ryukyu held the look without flinching, because she had spent her entire career being studied exactly this way by men deciding how much of her actual self they were willing to tolerate in exchange for her usefulness, and she had long ago stopped finding the experience intimidating rather than simply tiresome. "Let me be direct with you," Sakaki said eventually, closing the folder with a small, deliberate motion. "The Commission has a significant interest in confirming or denying whether the missing student Midoriya Izuku is connected to this entity. If he is alive, and if he has manifested a transformation of this magnitude, that is a matter of public safety that supersedes whatever personal sympathies you may have developed toward a student you briefly mentored." "Public safety," Ryukyu repeated. "Yes. He pulled 2 heroes out of a collapsing platform without injuring either of us further," Ryukyu said. "He held a structural section the size of a small building steady long enough for survivors to be extracted." "If that's the public safety threat you're concerned about, Director, I have to ask what exactly you think a safe version of that encounter would have looked like instead." "A contained one," Sakaki said, without apparent irony, and something in the flatness of his delivery told Ryukyu that he had said the word so many times in internal meetings that he had stopped hearing how it sounded out loud. "Predictable. Monitored. We are not in the business of hoping that uncontrolled, unprecedented quirks happen to behave themselves during crises, Captain." We are in the business of ensuring they cannot do otherwise. Sirius spoke before she had entirely decided to. He apologized to a training dummy once, she said. Sakaki blinked, the first crack in his composure since the meeting began. Excuse me. During a joint exercise, 2 years ago, Sirius said, her voice steady despite the sudden, vertiginous feeling of having committed to a thought halfway through speaking it. He broke a training dummy's arm during a rescue drill, by accident, and he apologized to it. Not to the instructor. Not to the room. To the dummy. Because some part of him couldn't separate the role he was practicing from the responsibility he felt toward anything he might hurt, even something that couldn't hear him. That's the boy whose quirk you're calling an uncontrolled threat. I don't think you've spent 5 minutes in a room with him, Director, and I don't think this folder has either. The room held its silence for a long moment. That's a charming anecdote, Sakaki said finally, in the tone of a man carefully filing the comment away as irrelevant rather than refuting it. It does not change the operational calculus. It should, Sirius said. Sakaki gathered his folder, signaling the meeting's end with the particular finality of someone who had decided the conversation had stopped being productive several minutes ago and was only now acting on the decision. We will continue monitoring for confirmed sightings. If either of you encounters this entity again, I expect a full and immediate report, Captain. Unredacted. He left without waiting for agreement, the way men in his position so often did, mistaking the absence of an argument for the presence of compliance. Ryukyu did not move for a long moment after the door closed. Sirius watched her captain's profile, the tight set of her jaw, the particular stillness of someone doing careful math behind an otherwise composed face. I shouldn't have said that, Sirius said eventually. About the dummy. You shouldn't have needed to, Ryukyu said. That's the part one can't get past. You shouldn't have had to remind a commission director that the boy he's calling an uncontrolled threat is the same boy who once apologized to furniture. He should already know that. He has access to the same personnel files I do. He doesn't want to know it, Sirius said. Knowing it would make the containment harder to justify. Ryukyu was quiet for a moment, looking at her own hands on the table, the faint pale scarring along her knuckles from a career of injuries the public rarely saw because dragon scale healed faster and cleaner than human skin, leaving the visible damage almost entirely on the parts of her that still looked ordinary. I keep thinking about something he said, she admitted. On the deck. About the memo calling my dragon form a managed liability and his quirk an unmanageable threat, and the only real difference being which of us they'd already learned to profit from. Do you think he's wrong? Sirius asked. No, Ryukyu said. That's what frightens me. I don't think he's wrong at all. Chapter 8. 3 weeks passed before either of them returned to open water with any intention beyond routine patrol, and in that time the surface world did what the surface world always did with stories too strange to fully control. It fractured the narrative into pieces small enough to manage. Some outlets ran the story straight, an unidentified deep-sea entity, possibly a previously uncatalogued species, assisting in a dramatic rescue during the Tidebreaker attack, accompanied by grainy footage and speculative marine biology commentary from experts who had clearly never seen anything like it and were nonetheless eager to offer competent theories. Other outlets, fed by careful leaks that Ryukyu suspected, without proof, originated from inside the commission itself, ran a different angle entirely, framing the entity as a potential new threat, an unprecedented kaiju-scale anomaly that demonstrated the urgent need for expanded maritime containment protocols and increased commission funding for deep-sea monitoring technology. Nowhere, in any version the public consumed, did Izuku Midoriya's name appear. Ryukyu noticed, with a kind of grim, exhausted satisfaction, that whatever internal debate had occurred after Sakaki's debrief, someone above his pay grade had apparently decided that confirming the connection publicly created more liability than it resolved. A missing hero student transformed into an unstoppable sea monster made for a worse headline than an unidentified entity of unknown origin, particularly for an organization whose entire public mandate rested on the promise that its rigorous selection and training process produced heroes, not monsters. She found herself, in the quiet hours of those 3 weeks, returning often to the water's edge, standing on the agency's private dock at hours when no one else was awake to ask her why, looking out at the dark line of the horizon and feeling, increasingly, like a woman standing at the border of a country she had not yet decided whether she was permitted to enter. Sirius found her there on the 11th night, wrapped in a coat against an autumn chill that did not seem to touch the captain at all, scales or no scales, and settled onto the dock beside her without being invited, because 3 years of partnership had taught her that Ryukyu rarely minded company she had not specifically requested, as long as the company knew when to stay quiet. "You haven't gone in once," Sirius said eventually, when the silence had stretched long enough to feel less like peace and more like a question waiting to be asked. "Neither have you," Ryukyu pointed out. "I'm waiting for you to go first," Sirius admitted, with the particular honesty she reserved for conversations that mattered. "You're the captain. I follow your lead on operational decisions." "This feels like an operational decision, even though I don't think anyone in that building downtown would call it one." Ryukyu laughed, short and humorless, more breath than sound. "It's not operational. It's personal. I keep telling myself I'd be going to confirm a commission lead, gathering intelligence, doing my job. And every single time I think the sentence through, I know it's a lie I'm telling myself so I don't have to admit the real reason I want to go back in that water." "Which is?" Sirius prompted, gently. "Because for the first time in 20 years of doing this job," Ryukyu said, "someone looked at what I am and didn't see a liability to manage or an asset to monetize." He looked at my dragon form pinned under a collapsing platform and the only thing he seemed to feel was fear that he hadn't reached me fast enough. Not fear of me. Fear for me. I don't think anyone outside this agency has looked at me that way in years." Sirius considered that for a long moment, watching the dark water lap gently against the dock's pilings, ordinary, unremarkable, giving away absolutely nothing about what might move beneath it 40 kilometers out. "I keep thinking about the gardens," she said finally. "The gardens. The ones he mentioned. Warm water gardens, things that bloom because of mineral vents instead of sunlight. I grew up on a fishing boat, Captain. My father used to tell me there were places in the deep trenches where life found a way to exist without ever once touching sunlight, whole ecosystems running on heat and chemistry instead of light, things science barely understood because almost nothing built by human hands could survive long enough at that depth to study them properly. I used to think that was the most romantic thing I'd ever heard, and then I grew up and went to work for agencies that measured my worth in rescue completion percentages, and I stopped thinking about romantic things for a long time. And now," Ryukyu asked. "And now I keep imagining what it would look like," Sirius admitted. "A whole city built around exactly that kind of impossible, sunlight-starved life. I keep imagining it the way I used to imagine bedtime stories, except I think this one's actually real, and I think I want to see it more than I've wanted anything in longer than I can comfortably admit." Ryukyu turned to look at her properly for the first time since she'd sat down. "Is that a vote?" she asked. "To go. It's a vote to stop pretending we haven't already decided," Sirius said. "We've spent 3 weeks finding reasons to stand on this dock instead of getting in a boat. I don't think either of us is actually undecided anymore, Captain. I think we're just scared of what it means to admit that out loud." Ryukyu was quiet for a long time, long enough that Sirius began to wonder if she had overstepped, before her captain finally exhaled, slow and deliberate, the particular controlled breath of someone choosing to commit to something irreversible. "If we go," Ryukyu said, "we go as ourselves. Not as commission assets gathering intelligence. Not pretending this is a sanctioned mission. If anyone asks, this was our choice, made with open eyes, and I won't have either of us lying about that afterward the way I struck that line from the report." Sirius felt something in her chest loosen that she had not fully realized was clenched. "Agreed," she said. They left at dawn, in a small unmarked launch Ryukyu kept for personal use, telling no one at the agency where they were going, carrying nothing but a single waterproof case of emergency supplies and the particular silence of 2 people who had each spent a long, sleepless month arriving independently at the same decision and were only now admitting it to each other. Chapter 9. The water told Izuku they were coming roughly 2 hours before the launch reached open water deep enough to matter, a faint disturbance threading through the currents that he had learned, over the preceding month, to read the way he had once read the subtle tells in an opponent's stance, small information accumulating into certainty. He surfaced to meet them at a respectful distance from the boat, in the smaller serpentine shape he had learned to favor for encounters that did not require his full overwhelming scale, his head and the first dozen meters of his coiled length breaking the surface in a long, unhurried arc that sent gentle waves rolling out toward the small launch without ever threatening to capsize it. "You came," he said, and something in the dual resonance of his voice, water and air both, carried a note Ryukyu had not heard from him before, a kind of careful, guarded hope that he seemed determined not to let fully surface in his tone, as though he had spent the intervening weeks preparing himself for the possibility that they would not. "We came," Ryukyu confirmed, standing at the launch's railing with the particular steadiness of someone determined not to let nerves show. "To see," Sirius added, before silence could stretch too long. "Not to decide. Not yet. Just to see what you've actually built down there, before either of us makes a choice we can't take back." "That's fair," Izuku said. "That's more than fair. I wasn't expecting either of you to come at all, honestly. I half thought I'd said too much on that deck." "You said exactly enough," Ryukyu said. He let them down slowly, matching his pace to the limitations of human lungs and the launch's small onboard diving equipment, a deliberate patience that Ryukyu noted with quiet interest, given how effortlessly he could have simply pulled them down at whatever speed his own body preferred. He had thought, she realized, about what this descent would feel like from their side of it, had planned for their comfort with a level of consideration she found difficult to reconcile with the Commission's persistent description of him as an uncontrolled threat. The light went the way Izuku remembered it going for himself, gold fracturing into blue and then into deepening indigo, and Ryukyu, in her full dragon form, found the transition easier to bear than Sirius did in her human shape, breathing carefully through the launch's borrowed equipment, her constellation patterns beginning to glow faintly along her arms and shoulders as her quirk responded, instinctively, to the deepening dark. "It's so much colder than I expected," Sirius said, her voice carrying oddly through the water, distorted by the equipment but still recognizably hers. "It won't be, soon," Izuku said. "There's a thermocline about 40 meters below us. Once we're past it, you'll understand what I mean." He was right. The cold gave way, abruptly, to something that should have been impossible at this depth, a gentle, mineral-scented warmth radiating up from somewhere below, carrying with it the first hints of light that did not come from the thin, fading sun far above them, a slow, living blue-green glow rising from the depths like dawn arriving sideways instead of from above. Sirius felt her own breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with her diving equipment. "There," Izuku said, quiet, almost shy, in a way that struck Ryukyu as strangely, achingly familiar, the same hesitant pride she remembered from a much smaller boy showing her, during a training exercise years ago, a rescue technique he had clearly spent weeks perfecting alone before risking anyone else's judgment of it. The basin opened beneath them like a wound the ocean had decided, instead of healing, to fill with light. Towers rose from the basin floor in slow black spirals, their surfaces catching the warm vent glow in patterns that shifted and pulsed faintly, alive in some way that had nothing to do with any construction material either of them recognized. Between the towers, vast gardens spread in colors that belonged to no surface reef either woman had ever studied, deep violets and bioluminescent golds and a strange, breathing crimson that seemed to pulse in time with something Ryukyu, after a long moment, realized was the same slow rhythm as Izuku's own bioluminescent markings, as though the entire garden answered to a single shared heartbeat. And the creatures. Ryukyu had spent her career around heroes whose quirks granted them dramatic, photographable transformations, and she had thought herself difficult to startle by unusual biology. She found, watching shapes the size of houses drift between the towers with slow, unhurried grace, shapes with no name in any marine biology textbook she had ever read, that she had badly underestimated how much the deep ocean still had left to surprise her with. "That's a kraken," Sirius said, her voice gone faint with something between awe and disbelief, pointing toward the vast mantled shape settled in the basin's deepest trench, larger than anything she had imagined the word could possibly describe. "He doesn't have a name yet either," Izuku said. "Most of them don't. I haven't felt the need to assign one. Down here, names feel like something the surface needs more than anything down here actually does." He led them lower, into the basin itself, past towers that, on closer inspection, revealed intricate carved details along their spiraling surfaces, scenes Ryukyu could not immediately interpret, depictions of the very ancient creatures now drifting peacefully around them, rendered in a style that belonged to no human artistic tradition either woman recognized, organic and flowing and strange. Did you carve these? Ryukyu asked. I think some part of me has always wanted to make things, Izuku admitted. I used to fill notebooks with Quirk analysis because I couldn't stop noticing patterns I needed somewhere to put. Down here, the patterns are different, but the impulse feels the same. I see the shape something could become, and I can't quite leave it alone until I've helped it become that. They surfaced eventually inside an enormous air pocket Izuku had carved into the heart of the central tower, a vast chamber lit by the same warm bioluminescent glow as the gardens outside, breathable air trapped and circulated through some mechanism neither woman fully understood and Izuku did not entirely volunteer to explain, as though the explanation mattered less to him than the simple fact of having created somewhere they could finally remove their diving equipment and speak without distortion. It's beautiful, Sirius said, turning slowly to take in the full scope of the chamber, her voice unsteady in a way she made no effort to hide. It's not finished, Izuku said, and something in the admission carried a vulnerability that surprised Ryukyu, coming from a creature large enough to lift a collapsing platform without visible effort. Nothing down here is finished. I don't know if it's supposed to be. I think maybe that's the point. The surface always wanted me finished, settled into a fixed classification, contained within parameters someone else decided on in advance. Down here nothing has to be finished to be allowed to exist. Ryukyu, still in her dragon form because the chamber scale comfortably accommodated it, settled onto the warm stone floor with a slow, deliberate motion, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, no urgency at all to make herself smaller for anyone's comfort. I haven't sat like this in years, she admitted. Full size. No meeting to attend afterward where someone measures whether my scale made the room uncomfortable. You don't have to make yourself smaller here, Izuku said, simply, without any particular weight on the words, as though the statement were obvious rather than significant. There's nothing down here that needs you smaller. There's nothing down here that needs either of you to be anything except exactly what you already are. Sirius, sitting on a smooth outcropping of warm stone with her constellation patterns still glowing faintly along her skin in the ambient light, found herself studying Izuku's vast, scaled form with an attention she had not allowed herself on the surface, surrounded by witnesses and crisis and the particular adrenaline-soaked urgency of rescue work that left no room for simply looking at something and letting herself feel whatever looking produced. You've changed, she said. I have, Izuku agreed. Not just the shape, Sirius clarified. The way you talk. The way you carry yourself, even like this, even with a body that doesn't move the way a person's body moves. You sound steadier than I remember. Calmer. Like something that used to be clenched and you finally let go. It did, Izuku said, quiet, and for a moment something old and tired moved behind the ancient blue-green eyes, briefly visible before the careful composure returned. I spent 16 years being told I had nothing worth protecting, and then a year and a half proving them wrong by breaking myself open over and over until something finally worked, and then 4 days being told that the something which finally worked needed to be put in a cage for everyone's safety. I think I just ran out of room to keep clenching. There wasn't anywhere left for the tension to go except out. Ryukyu studied him for a long moment, feeling something in her own chest ache in recognition she had not expected to feel this strongly. I know that feeling, she said. Better than I think I've ever told anyone. Chapter 10. They stayed 3 days, though none of them, afterward, could have explained with any precision how the decision to extend a single afternoon visit into 3 full days had actually been made, only that each hour seemed to produce some new detail of the kingdom worth lingering over, some new question worth asking, some new silence worth sitting in together rather than rushing past. Izuku showed them the warm vent gardens properly on the second day, leading them through winding channels between towers where bioluminescent flora bloomed in slow, patient cycles tied to currents rather than sunlight, where strange filter-feeding creatures drifted between blooms and shapes that belonged equally to nightmare and to wonder, depending entirely on the angle of the light. This one took weeks, Izuku said, gesturing with a clawed limb toward a particularly elaborate cluster of luminous coral analogues spiraling up from the basin floor in patterns that mirrored, Ryukyu realized slowly, the same spiral structure as his towers, as though some single guiding logic ran through everything he built down here, instinctive rather than deliberate. I kept adjusting the mineral balance in the surrounding water until the color held the right tone. I don't entirely know why it mattered to me that it held the right tone. It just did. It matters because you wanted to make something beautiful, Sirius said, and something true, not just functional. Izuku considered that for a long moment. Maybe, he admitted. On the surface, beauty always felt like a luxury reserved for people who'd already secured the basics. I never had room to want beautiful things. I wanted to be useful. Down here, I think I finally have enough security to want something more than that, and it surprised me how much I did want it, once I let myself notice. On the third day, Sirius found herself alone with him in the gardens while Ryukyu rested in the central chamber, the accumulated exhaustion of 3 days adjusting to pressure and cold finally catching up with even her considerable dragon stamina. Can I ask you something? Sirius said, settling onto a smooth outcropping near a bloom of slow-pulsing violet light. Always, Izuku said. Do you miss it? She asked. The surface. Not the commission, not the containment threats. I mean the ordinary parts. Rain. Sunlight on your skin. Walking somewhere instead of swimming. The smell of a city street after it rains. Izuku was quiet for a long moment, the ancient eye drifting toward the thin, distant suggestion of light filtering down from far above, the only visible evidence, this deep, that a surface even still existed. Sometimes, he admitted. I miss specific things more than the surface as a whole. I miss the smell of katsudon my mother used to make on hard days. I miss the particular quality of light right before sunset, the kind that turns everything gold for about 10 minutes and then is gone. I miss falling asleep tired from training instead of tired from simply existing under this much pressure, though I've adjusted to the pressure better than I expected to. Do you regret leaving? Sirius asked, carefully, watching his ancient eye rather than the rest of his vast, unreadable form, because she had learned, over 3 days, that whatever emotion moved through him showed first and most honestly in that single, vast, patient eye. No, Izuku said, without hesitation. I regret what made leaving necessary. I regret that the only path to a life where I didn't have to apologize for my own size ran straight through the bottom of the ocean. But I don't regret choosing it, once it was the only honest option left on the table. Sirius nodded slowly, processing that, feeling the weight of her own unresolved question pressing against the inside of her chest with an insistence she could no longer entirely postpone. I think I'm afraid, she admitted, quiet, the words coming out smaller than she intended. Of what? Izuku asked, gentle, patient, the same careful patience she remembered from a boy apologizing to a training dummy that could not hear him. Of choosing this, and then realizing in a year that I made the choice out of anger at the surface instead of out of anything real I felt about what's actually down here, she said. I don't want to run away from something. I want to run towards something, and I'm not entirely sure yet which one this would be, if I said yes. Izuku was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful, total attention he had once given to dissecting a hero's quirk mechanics in an old, half-forgotten notebook. I think, he said slowly, that you don't have to know the difference yet. I think the only honest thing either of us can do is keep being truthful about what we feel as we feel it, and trust that real reasons tend to outlast angry ones, the way real fire outlasts a flare. If you came down here only out of anger, I think the anger would have already burned itself out somewhere in these 3 days. The fact that you're still here, asking me hard questions instead of already halfway back to the surface, tells me something the anger alone never could have produced. Sirius felt something in her chest loosen, not fully, not completely, but enough to breathe around more easily than she had a moment before. That's a very patient answer, she said, faintly amused despite herself. I've had a month with nothing to do but think, Izuku said, and something in his voice carried the ghost of the wry, self-deprecating humor she remembered from the boy he had been, still present somewhere inside this vast new shape. Patient and quiet and unmistakably still entirely himself. Patience was about the only thing I had time to practice. They returned to the central chamber as the light from the surface, far above, finally faded entirely into true night, and found Ryukyu awake again, sitting upright against the warm stone wall, watching the slow bioluminescent pulse of the garden beyond the chamber's threshold with an expression neither of them had seen on her face before, something unguarded, something that looked, more than anything else, like a woman finally setting down a weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped consciously feeling its presence. I've made a decision, Ryukyu said, before either of them could ask. Izuku went very still, the ancient eye fixing on her with an intensity that, for the first time since they had arrived, looked almost like fear, the fear of someone bracing for a refusal he had quietly expected all along. "I'm not going back to the agency," Ryukyu said. "Not to stay. I'll surface when I need to, settle whatever needs settling, make sure no one assumes the worst and sends a search party after me the way they did after you. But the agency isn't where I want to spend whatever years I have left, answering to men who measure my worth by how well I photograph and how cheaply I can be deployed. I want to stay here. I want to help you build whatever this is becoming." Izuku did not move for a long moment, and Ryukyu, watching him, understood with sudden clarity that the vast, ancient, overwhelming creature in front of her was, underneath all of it, still a 16-year-old boy who had spent his entire life being told no, bracing instinctively against the possibility that even this, even now, might be taken away from him too. "Are you certain?" he asked, quiet, careful. "I've spent 20 years being certain about the wrong things," Ryukyu said. "I'm done pretending uncertainty is a virtue." "Yes. I'm certain." Sirius felt the decision settle in her own chest like a stone finding the bottom of a deep well, total, inevitable, and not nearly as frightening, now that it had actually arrived, as she had spent the last month fearing it would be. "Then I'm staying too," she said. "Not because I'm certain about everything yet. But because I'm certain about this much, and I think you said yourself that's supposed to be enough to start with." Something shifted in Izuku's vast form, subtle, almost imperceptible, the bioluminescent pulse along his spine brightening for a single unguarded moment before settling back into its usual slow, patient rhythm, and Ryukyu understood, watching it happen, that she had just witnessed something rare and entirely unrehearsed, an ancient, colossal sovereign of the deep, feeling, for the first time in a month of careful solitary composure, something close enough to pure, unguarded joy that his own body could not quite contain the evidence of it. "Welcome home," he said, and the words, carried through water and warm stone and bioluminescent light, settled over both of them like a tide finally, gently, coming all the way in. Chapter 11. Word reached the surface 11 days later, not through any leak or any careless transmission, but through the simple, undeniable fact that both Ryukyu and Sirius failed to report for their scheduled agency rotations, and that no amount of searching produced any trace of either hero anywhere within range of conventional tracking. The Commission's response was swift and, in Ryukyu's private, satisfied assessment once she finally learned of it weeks later, almost comically predictable. Director Sakaki convened an emergency review within 48 hours of the disappearance being formally logged, a review that, according to the partial transcripts Ryukyu would eventually access through contacts still loyal to her within the agency's administrative staff, spent considerably more time discussing public relations exposure than it spent discussing the well-being of two missing heroes. If both Ryukyu and the Sirius asset have voluntarily relocated to join the Midoriya entity, one commission analyst was recorded saying, with the particular bloodless calm that seemed endemic to that entire building, then we are facing a public confidence crisis considerably larger than a single missing student. We are facing the prospect of licensed, publicly beloved heroes choosing to abandon their commissions in favor of an unregistered deep-sea anomaly. That narrative, if it reaches the public in anything resembling its true form, actively undermines confidence in the entire hero licensing structure. Then we control the narrative before it reaches that form, Sakaki had apparently replied, and the agency's subsequent public statement, released 4 days later, described both heroes as currently engaged in an extended, classified deep-sea reconnaissance operation related to ongoing efforts to track the unidentified entity responsible for the Tidebreaker rescue, an explanation that satisfied exactly no one who had actually been paying close attention, but that proved sufficiently boring and bureaucratic to avoid generating the kind of sustained public scrutiny a more honest explanation would have invited. Ryukyu, learning of the statement secondhand weeks later, found herself laughing for the first time in longer than she could comfortably remember, a real laugh, unguarded, echoing off the warm stone walls of the chamber she had begun, privately, to think of as her own. "They're calling it reconnaissance," she told Izuku, who had drifted into the chamber at the sound of her laughter, curious despite himself. "Is that funny?" he asked. "It's the most honest lie they've told about me in 20 years, Ryukyu said. "I am, technically, gathering an enormous amount of new information down here. They've simply declined to mention that I have no intention of ever filing the report." Izuku's vast form shifted in something that, after a month of growing fluency at reading him, Ryukyu had learned to recognize as quiet amusement, a slow ripple along his spine that mirrored, almost exactly, the way the boy he had been once laughed with his whole chest before catching himself and trying, unsuccessfully, to look more composed. I used to worry, he admitted, that leaving would hurt people who actually cared. My mother. Some of my classmates. I still worry about that, some days, more than I let either of you see. But I notice I don't worry much anymore about whether I hurt the institution. I think that worry finally wore itself out somewhere around the third week I spent watching them call containment supported and call my own existence a threat requiring management. Have you thought about your mother? Sirius asked gently, drifting into the chamber behind them, having overheard enough of the conversation to recognize where it had turned. Every day, Izuku admitted, and something raw moved beneath the careful composure, briefly, before settling again. I haven't found a way to reach her that wouldn't immediately become a commission intelligence asset the moment it reached the surface. Every line of communication gets monitored eventually. I don't want my mother's grief turned into leverage against either of us. There might be a way, Ryukyu said slowly, an idea forming with the particular careful caution of someone testing a thought before committing to saying it aloud. Not through any channel the commission monitors. Something slower. Something that doesn't look like communication at all, to anyone who isn't specifically looking for it. What do you mean? Izuku asked. The sea reaches every coastline eventually, Ryukyu said. Things wash ashore that no one questions, driftwood, shells, the ordinary debris of an ocean that's always quietly redistributing itself. If something specific washed up somewhere your mother would find it, somewhere private, somewhere with no obvious connection to you at all, it would never register as the kind of signal the Commission's monitoring systems are built to catch. Izuku was quiet for a long moment, turning the idea over with visible care. I don't know if I'm ready, he admitted finally. Not because I don't want to reach her. Because I don't know yet what I'd actually want to say, and I don't want to send her something half-finished, something that raises more fear than comfort. I need to be more certain first, of what this kingdom actually is, of what I can honestly promise her about my safety here, before I ask her to carry the weight of knowing where I am and not telling anyone. That's fair, Sirius said. There's no deadline on this. She's not going anywhere, and apparently, Sirius added, with a faint, wry smile, neither are we. Izuku's ancient eye softened at that, something grateful and unguarded passing behind the bioluminescent glow, and Ryukyu, watching the exchange, found herself thinking, not for the first time since arriving, that whatever else this strange new life would demand of her, she did not regret a single hour of the choice that had brought her here. Outside the chamber, in the warm vent gardens, the kraken shifted in its trench, settling deeper into a sleep that had lasted, by Izuku's estimation, several decades before his arrival had given it a reason, finally, to wake. Schools of luminous fish drifted between towers that continued, slowly, patiently, to grow taller, and somewhere in the basin's deepest, darkest corner, something else, something Izuku had not yet fully investigated, stirred faintly in response to the kingdom's growing warmth, ancient and curious and, for the first time in longer than even it could remember, no longer entirely alone in the dark. Chapter 12. The first true test of what they had built together came not from the Commission, and not from any villain coalition seeking the same opportunistic chaos that had driven the Tidebreaker attack, but from something older, and considerably less interested in negotiation. It announced itself on the kingdom's 7th week with a tremor that ran through the basin floor deep enough to rattle every tower Izuku had carved, a low, grinding pressure wave that Ryukyu, resting in the central chamber, felt before she heard, a sensation she recognized instantly, from a career spent around seismic disaster response, as something the ocean floor itself was actively, violently rearranging. Izuku felt it more intimately than either of them, a vast, instinctive alarm flooding upward through whatever sense connected him to the deep stone beneath his kingdom, an awareness not of danger exactly, but of intrusion, something ancient and proprietary stirring in territory that some old, patient part of him had already, without quite realizing it, begun to think of as his. Something's moving through the trench system to the south, he said, already turning, his vast form coiling with sudden, focused urgency that neither woman had seen from him since the Tidebreaker rescue. Something big. Bigger than anything I've felt down here so far, and it's not behaving the way the other deep creatures behave around the kingdom. It's not curious. It's not settling. It's circling. Ryukyu transformed without needing to be asked, her dragon form filling the chamber's available space in a rush of pale scale and storm-colored wing, and Sirius felt her own constellation patterns flare bright with the automatic readiness of someone who had spent her entire career preparing for exactly this kind of uncertain, escalating threat. "What is it?" Sirius asked. "I don't know yet," Izuku admitted, and something in the admission, the simple, unguarded honesty of a sovereign confessing the limits of his own awareness, struck Ryukyu as remarkable, given how thoroughly the surface had always demanded that heroes project certainty even when certainty was a lie. "But I intend to find out before it reaches the gardens." They moved together through the dark water beyond the kingdom's furthest towers, Izuku in his full colossal scale now, vast and luminous and unmistakably sovereign, Ryukyu coiling through the current beside him in dragon form, Sirius swimming close at his flank with her constellation light building toward full output, the three of them moving with a coordination that surprised all of them slightly, given how recently they had begun moving as anything resembling a unit at all. The trench, when they reached it, breathed cold water up from depths even Izuku had not yet fully explored, a vast black scar in the ocean floor that swallowed his bioluminescent light within the first 100 meters of its descent, offering nothing back except darkness and the faint, distant suggestion of movement, vast and deliberate, circling slowly upward toward them through depths that no surface technology had ever successfully mapped. "It's old," Izuku said, quiet, something in his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of genuine uncertainty. "Older than anything else I've felt down here. I don't think it's hostile exactly. I think it's testing. The way a territory holder tests a new arrival, to see whether the new arrival actually has the strength to hold what it's claimed. Then we hold it," Ryukyu said, simply, without hesitation, and Izuku, glancing toward her with something that might, in a more human face, have been gratitude too large for easy expression, found himself steadied by the simple, total certainty in her voice. "Together," he said. "Together," Sirius agreed, and the three of them turned, as one, to face whatever was rising toward them out of the oldest, darkest part of the kingdom they had each, in their own way, finally chosen to call home. Chapter 13. What surfaced from the trench was not, in the end, a single creature, but something closer to a procession, a slow column of vast, segmented shapes rising in deliberate formation, their carapaces catching what little light reached this depth in dull, ancient flashes of deep amber and bruised purple, easily as long as the central tower Izuku had carved, and moving with the unhurried, processional patience of something that had never once in its existence needed to hurry for anything. At their head moved something larger still, a creature whose shape resisted easy description even to Izuku's newly expanded senses, vaguely serpentine but ringed with armored plates that overlapped like the scales of some impossible, ancient fish, eyes set deep beneath ridges of bone that had clearly weathered pressures and ages the rest of the basin's residents had never approached. It did not announce itself the way Izuku had announced himself to the dying platform, with breach and light and overwhelming scale. It simply rose, slow and total, until its ancient gaze settled level with Izuku's own, two sovereigns regarding each other across a gulf of age that Izuku felt, immediately and humbly, that he had no real claim to bridge. Ryukyu felt the pressure of its attention even in dragon form, a weight that had nothing to do with physical mass and everything to do with the particular gravity that very old, very patient things seemed to carry simply by existing long enough to stop needing to prove anything. "You are young," the creature said, and the voice that arrived was unlike Izuku's dual resonance, older, slower, carrying the particular cadence of something that measured time in geological terms rather than human ones. "You have built quickly. You have built well. I have watched the warmth bleed upward from your gardens for 7 of your weeks, and I have come to learn whether the one who built them understands what he has claimed." "I didn't know this territory was claimed," Izuku said, careful, measured, the old habit of cataloging an opponent's capabilities before committing to a response settling over him with familiar ease even in a body built for entirely different combat. "I would not have built here if I'd known I was building over something already settled." The ancient creature's gaze did not waver. "This trench has been mine since before the surface above it wore the shape it wears now," it said. "I do not begrudge you the warmth you have built. The vents have slept long enough that I had nearly forgotten what living color looked like, before your gardens reminded this water how to bloom. But a territory this rich draws more than gratitude, young sovereign. It draws hunger. Things that have slept in colder, hungrier trenches for longer than your kind has existed will smell warmth and color from 100 leagues distant, and they will come testing, the way I have come testing, except not all of them will arrive with my patience, and fewer still will leave again once they understand what they have found. Izuku absorbed that slowly, feeling the shape of the warning settle into place alongside everything else he had learned in 7 weeks of building a kingdom from instinct and hope rather than any inherited wisdom. You're saying I've made us a target, he said. You have made yourselves a beacon, the ancient creature corrected. There is a difference, though the difference matters less to the things drawn toward you than it does to you. A target is chosen. A beacon simply shines, and trusts whatever notices the light to mean it well. I have lived long enough to learn that trust is rarely wise, in the deepest dark. I have come to see whether the one who built this beacon has the strength to defend it, or whether I should simply take what you have built before something crueler arrives to take it instead. Ryukyu felt herself tense, the old, familiar readiness of a hero anticipating combat settling over her dragon form, but Izuku, beside her, did something she had not expected. He lowered his vast head, not in submission exactly, but in something closer to open, deliberate honesty. I don't know if I have the strength yet, he admitted. I know I have the will. I know that everyone who has chosen to stand beside me down here chose it freely, after being told their entire lives that what they were was either too much or never enough, and I will not let anything take that from them without finding out exactly how much strength I actually have. But I won't pretend to you that I've already tested every limit of what I am. I haven't. I've only had 7 weeks. The ancient creature was silent for a long moment, its deep-set eyes studying Izuku with an attention that felt, Ryukyu thought, less like a predator assessing prey and more like a teacher assessing whether a student's honesty outweighed the gaps in his preparation. That is the correct answer, the creature said finally, and something in its ancient voice carried, unmistakably, the ghost of approval. Not the strength to claim invincibility. The honesty to admit its absence, and the will to close the gap regardless. I have outlived 11 sovereigns who claimed invincibility in this trench before you, young one. Every one of them is bones now, scattered across a seabed that has long since stopped remembering their names. I did not survive this long by rewarding arrogance. I survived it by recognizing, eventually, which young claimants were worth teaching, and which were simply worth outlasting. You're offering to teach me, Izuku said, something cautious and hopeful moving beneath the words in equal measure. I am offering to test you properly, the creature corrected, first. And if you survive the testing with the honesty you have already shown me intact, then yes, I may have something worth teaching a sovereign young enough to still be capable of learning it. My name, in the tongue this trench remembers before your kind ever pronounced anything resembling language, is something your throat was never built to shape. You may simply call me what the old currents call me. Tide Warden. Then teach me, Tide Warden, Izuku said, and Ryukyu, watching the exchange unfold with a held breath she had not realized she was holding, understood that she was witnessing something rarer than combat, an old and isolated power choosing, deliberately, to extend itself toward a successor rather than simply outlasting another pretender to the same dark throne. The testing that followed lasted the better part of 2 days, brutal in a way that left even Ryukyu's considerable dragon stamina strained by its conclusion, currents bent into crushing vortices that Izuku had to learn to read and counter in real time, ancient burrowing things summoned from the trench's deepest folds to test his reflexes against attacks that came from directions no surface combat training had ever prepared him for, pressure differentials deliberately manufactured to test whether his new body's tolerance held under conditions considerably harsher than anything the basin's gentle warmth had yet demanded of him. He failed parts of it. He failed badly, twice, driven to the trench floor by pressure waves he had not anticipated, his bioluminescent markings flickering weakly in something that looked, alarmingly, like exhaustion bleeding into genuine vulnerability. Ryukyu fought the instinct to intervene each time, understanding, somewhere beneath the protective urgency, that this was a test Izuku needed to pass on his own terms, that her interference would teach the Tide Warden nothing true about the sovereign she had already chosen to follow. He rose each time. Slower, the second time, breathing harder in whatever way his vast new lungs processed breath, but he rose, and on the final test, when the Tide Warden summoned a pressure wave large enough that even Ryukyu felt it compress the water around her dragon form like a physical fist, Izuku met it not with raw strength alone but with something Ryukyu recognized immediately, having watched him train on the surface a lifetime ago in a much smaller body. Analysis, applied in real time, the old habit of cataloging a threat's exact mechanics and finding the precise angle where strength mattered less than understanding. He did not stop the wave. He redirected it, a fraction of a degree, enough that its full force slid past him rather than through him, and the Tide Warden, watching the maneuver unfold with the same deep-set, ancient eyes, made a sound that took Ryukyu several seconds to correctly identify as something like laughter. "Good," the Tide Warden said. "Very good. You did not waste strength proving you had it. You spent intelligence instead, and saved your strength for when intelligence would not be enough. That is the lesson 11 dead sovereigns never learned in this trench, young one. Strength answers the question of whether you survive a single encounter. Intelligence answers the question of whether you survive long enough to need to." Chapter 14. The Tide Warden did not become a resident of the kingdom in any formal sense, choosing instead to remain in the deep trench it had occupied for longer than memory could measure, but it became, in the weeks that followed, something Izuku had not expected to find this far into an already improbable new life, an actual teacher, ancient and patient and entirely unlike anything the surface had ever offered him. It taught him to read the deep currents the way a navigator reads stars, the slow, patient circulation systems that carried warmth and nutrients across the entire ocean floor on cycles measured in centuries rather than seasons. It taught him which of the basin's deep visitors arrived out of simple curiosity and which arrived already calculating whether the kingdom's gardens were worth the risk of confronting its sovereign, a distinction Izuku found, with some discomfort, he had not previously known to look for. It taught him, slowly, the old etiquette of the deep, a set of unspoken protocols governing territory and respect that had apparently governed the ocean floor's ancient residents for ages before any surface dweller had ever successfully mapped the deep trenches at all. Protocols that made the basin's continued safety considerably less a matter of brute strength and considerably more a matter of earned, careful diplomacy among powers that had simply never needed to negotiate with the surface world because the surface world had never been strong enough to require it. "You are the first sovereign I have taught in longer than I am comfortable admitting," the Tide Warden told him, during one of their long, unhurried sessions in the trench's deepest fold, where the ancient creature seemed most at ease. "The others who claimed territory near my trench in recent ages built nothing. They simply took, consumed, and eventually starved their own claims into barren ruin through sheer carelessness. You build gardens. You teach the small luminous fish to trust your light rather than fear it. You have brought 2 surface dwellers down into the dark and given them a home instead of a cage, when every sovereign before you who encountered surface dwellers treated them only as either threats or meals. I find myself, against considerable accumulated cynicism, curious what kind of kingdom you will have built by the time you are as old as I am." "I don't know either," Izuku admitted. "I'm building this the same way I built everything on the surface, honestly. By noticing what's missing, and trying to fill it, one piece at a time, without always knowing what the finished shape will look like until considerably after I've already started building it." "That is," the Tide Warden said, with what Izuku had learned to recognize as its particular dry, ancient amusement, possibly the most honest description of how anything worthwhile has ever been built, in any ocean, on any timescale. "I would not trust a sovereign who claimed otherwise." Ryukyu and Sirius, in those same weeks, found their own rhythms settling into the kingdom's strange new architecture of time, days measured not by sunrise but by the slow brightening and dimming of the garden's bioluminescent cycles, nights spent in the central chamber trading stories about the surface lives they had left behind with a candor that neither of them had ever quite managed while still technically employed by an agency that monitored their every public statement for liability. Exposure. Ryukyu took to patrolling the kingdom's outer perimeter in dragon form, a role that mirrored her old surface duties closely enough to feel familiar while differing from them in the one respect that mattered most. She patrolled now because she wanted to, because the gardens and the towers and the strange, ancient creatures drifting peacefully between them had become, in a remarkably short span of weeks, something she found herself genuinely invested in protecting, rather than simply contracted. 2. Sirius, for her part, discovered that her constellation Quirk, treated on the surface primarily as a rescue and combat tool, found an entirely new purpose in the kingdom's permanent dark, her bioluminescent light becoming something closer to language than weapon, a means of communicating across distances and depths where sound traveled strangely and sight depended entirely on whatever light a person carried with them. She began teaching some of the basin's smaller luminous fish to recognize specific light patterns, simple signals at first: danger, safety, food, curiosity, and found, with quiet delight, that the fish learned faster than she expected, as though some old evolutionary memory in their bioluminescent biology had simply been waiting for someone patient enough to finally speak their language properly. "We're building something none of us fully understand yet," Ryukyu said one evening. The three of them gathered in the central chamber as the gardens beyond dimmed toward whatever passed, this deep, for night. "I keep waiting for the part where it stops feeling this good. Where the cost catches up with the choice. I've made enough difficult decisions in my career to know that the difficult ones usually come with a delayed bill. Maybe this is just what it feels like, the first time a decision doesn't come with a bill attached," Sirius offered. "Maybe we've simply never made one this honest before." Izuku, listening from across the chamber, found himself thinking of the Tidewarden's warning, the beacon drawing hunger from trenches considerably colder and hungrier than the one they had already survived testing, and though he said nothing of it that evening, unwilling to disturb the rare, settled peace the three of them had finally found together, some old, patient part of him understood that Ryukyu's instinct was not wrong. The bill was coming. He simply did not yet know its size, or how soon it would arrive, or how much of what they had built together it would eventually demand of them in payment. He only knew, watching Ryukyu's dragon form settle into easy rest against the chamber's warm stone wall, and Sirius's constellation light dim gently toward sleep beside her, that whatever the bill eventually demanded, he intended to make absolutely certain it never touched either of them without going through him first. Chapter 15. The bill the Tidewarden had warned of arrived on the kingdom's 11th week, and it did not arrive quietly. Izuku felt at first as a disturbance in the deep current network the Tidewarden had spent weeks teaching him to read, a cold, wrong pressure bleeding in from the open ocean far beyond the basin's furthest ridges, moving with none of the patient, processional dignity the Tidewarden's own approach had carried. This pressure came fast, and it came hungry, and it came in numbers that made Izuku's vast chest tighten with an instinct he had not yet learned the name for but recognized immediately as fear, not for himself, but for everything he had spent 11 weeks building. Ryukyu felt his alarm before he spoke it, the bioluminescent pulse along his spine spiking into an erratic, urgent rhythm she had learned, over weeks of close partnership, to associate with genuine danger rather than mere caution. "What is it?" she asked, already transforming, the chamber filling with the rush of pale scale and storm-colored wing. "Deep dwellers," Izuku said, his voice carrying an edge she had not heard from him since the Tidebreaker rescue. "Not one. A swarm. The Tidewarden warned me something like this might come eventually, drawn by the warmth, but I didn't expect it this soon, and I didn't expect this many." Sirius arrived at the chamber's threshold already lit in full constellation brightness, her expression hardening into the particular focused calm she reserved for crises that demanded action rather than emotion. "How many is a swarm?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Izuku admitted. "I've never had to count something like this before." They found out within the hour, gathered at the kingdom's southern perimeter where the warm vent gardens gave way to colder, darker water, watching a vast, shifting cloud of luminous eyes approach from the open trench beyond, hundreds of them, each attached to a creature roughly the size of a large dog, segmented and many-legged, moving in a coordinated, swarming mass that suggested some shared, hive-like intelligence rather than hundreds of individual hunters acting alone. "Abyssal scuttlers," the Tidewarden's voice arrived through the current a moment later, the ancient creature itself surfacing from its trench at speed Izuku had not previously witnessed it use, urgency replacing its usual unhurried patience. "I had hoped you would have more time before they found you. They hunt in collective swarms, drawn to warmth and bioluminescence in equal measure, and they do not stop, young sovereign, until either the warmth is consumed or every scuttler in the swarm is destroyed. There is no negotiating with a hive mind that has already decided your gardens are food." "How do we stop them?" Ryukyu asked, already angling her dragon form toward the approaching swarm with the readiness of someone who had fought worse odds with considerably less preparation. "You do not fight them individually," the Tidewarden said. A swarm of this size will simply reroute around an individual threat and continue toward the warmth regardless. You must break their coordination at its source. Somewhere within that mass swims a brood mother, larger than the rest, the creature whose pheromone trail the others follow without question. Remove her, and the swarm fragments into individual scuttlers easily managed by 3 sovereigns of your combined strength. Fail to find her in time, and you will spend the rest of this day fighting 100 separate small battles while she simply directs more scuttlers to flank you from depths you have not yet learned to watch. Izuku absorbed the information with the same fast, total focus he had once brought to analyzing a villain's quirk mechanics in the margins of a battered notebook, and Ryukyu, watching the transformation happen in real time, the careful, analytical boy reasserting himself beneath the vast sovereign scale, felt something settle in her own chest, a confidence that came not from his raw power but from the simple, familiar fact of watching him think. "Sirius," she said, "can your light pattern actually reach into that mass without giving away our position before we're ready?" "I can make it look like confusion instead of attack," Sirius said, already understanding the shape of the plan forming. Scuttlers hunting by collective instinct should respond to disorienting light the same way fish do. If I scatter false signals through the swarm's outer edge, it might buy enough chaos for you to find the broodmother before she reorganizes them around me as the new threat. "Do it," Izuku said. "Ryukyu, stay with me. We go for the broodmother together. If she's larger than the others, she'll be near the swarm's center, which means we'll need to punch through considerably more resistance than Sirius's light alone can manage." "Understood," Ryukyu said, and there was no hesitation in the word at all, only the easy, total trust of someone who had already decided, weeks ago, exactly how much of her own safety she was willing to entrust to this strange, vast, careful creature beside her. The battle that followed tested every lesson the Tide Warden had spent weeks teaching Izuku, currents weaponized in both directions, scuttlers swarming in coordinated waves that broke and reformed with unsettling speed whenever Ryukyu's claws or Izuku's own crushing bulk thinned their numbers, the entire basin filling with a churning, chittering chaos of segmented limbs and luminous, hungry eyes that seemed, for several long minutes, genuinely capable of overwhelming even 3 sovereigns acting in close coordination. Sirius's light bought them the opening they needed at the cost nearly to herself, scuttlers redirecting toward her constellation glow in confused, contradictory waves that left her surrounded, briefly, by more hostile shapes than even her formidable defensive reflexes could fully account for, until Izuku, catching the shift in the swarm's collective attention, tore through the mass separating them with a speed that startled even Ryukyu, who had begun, by this point, to think she had a reasonably accurate sense of his physical limits. He found the broodmother exactly where the Tide Warden had predicted, vast among her own kind though still smaller than Izuku's full scale, directing the swarm's coordinated assault with rapid pulses of pheromone-laden current that Izuku, with newly trained senses, could finally perceive as something close to language, urgent, simple, total in its singular focus on the warmth ahead. He did not kill her, in the end, though every instinct screaming through his vast new body told him that ending the swarm's coordination permanently would be the safest, simplest resolution available. Instead, in the final seconds before Ryukyu's claws would have closed the distance for a killing strike, he caught the broodmother's writhing bulk in his own and held her still, not crushing, simply containing, the same gesture he had once used to catch a collapsing platform from claiming 2 lives it had no right to claim. "Call them back," he said. And though scuttlers had no language a surface mind would recognize as speech, something in the total, patient pressure of his voice, carried through current and bone and water all at once, seemed to reach whatever passed for the broodmother's understanding. "This warmth isn't food. It's a kingdom. There's room here for things that don't need to consume it to survive near it, if your swarm is willing to learn the difference." The broodmother thrashed once, twice, testing the strength of his grip, and finding it absolute, finally stilled, and the pheromone pulses she sent rippling outward through the water shifted, subtly, from the urgent command that had driven her swarm forward into something calmer, more uncertain, a question rather than an order. The scuttlers stopped. Chapter 16. The negotiation that followed, if it could be called a negotiation, took the better part of a day, conducted in the strange, patient pressure language Izuku found himself increasingly fluent in the longer he spent this deep, the broodmother's pheromone pulses translating, slowly, into something approaching genuine communication once she understood that the vast sovereign holding her had no intention of consuming her swarm regardless of how the conversation concluded. You could simply destroy us, the broodmother's pulses conveyed eventually, once enough trust had accumulated to risk the admission. Other sovereigns have, when our hunger reached their territory. It would be the safer choice. It would be the easier choice, Izuku corrected. I've stopped assuming those are the same thing. What do you want from us? The broodmother asked, in the same wary, pulsing rhythm. I want you to stop hunting my gardens, Izuku said. In exchange, there's a section of the basin's outer ridge, colder than the central gardens, where I could redirect some of the vent warmth without disrupting the central blooms. Not enough to feed a swarm your current size indefinitely. Enough to mean your scuttlers wouldn't need to swarm this far from your own territory just to survive the season. You'd have to trust that I mean what I'm offering, and I understand that's a difficult thing to trust, coming from someone who spent the last day holding your broodmother captive. The broodmother's pulses went quiet for a long moment, processing the offer with whatever calculus governed a hive intelligence's decision-making. Why? She asked finally. Sovereigns claim territory. They do not share it with hungry things that threatened their gardens hours earlier. Because I spent most of my life being the hungry thing other people's territories had no room for, Izuku said, simple, direct, without any particular weight on the admission beyond its plain truth. I know what it feels like to be told there's no room. I'm not interested in building a kingdom that just recreates that feeling for everything smaller than me. The broodmother's response, when it finally came, carried something that Izuku, increasingly fluent in reading the subtle textures of pressure language, recognized as the deep ocean's closest equivalent to genuine astonishment. Then we accept, she said. And we will not forget which sovereign chose mercy when destruction would have cost him nothing. He released her slowly, watching the scuttler swarm reorganize itself around her with visible relief, hundreds of small, segmented bodies settling into a loose, watchful formation that no longer carried any trace of the coordinated hunger that had driven their assault, and Ryukyu, watching the entire exchange unfold from a respectful distance, found herself thinking, not for the first time since arriving in this strange new kingdom, that the boy she had once briefly mentored had grown into something considerably wiser than any 16-year-old, on the surface or beneath it, had any reasonable right to be. You could have ended that fight an hour earlier, she said, once the scuttler swarm had begun its slow retreat toward the outer ridge Izuku had offered them, settling into the unfamiliar new territory with the particular wary caution of creatures testing whether a promised mercy would actually hold. I know, Izuku said. Why didn't you? Ryukyu asked, not in accusation, but in genuine, curious search for the reasoning beneath the choice. Because the Tide Warden told me 11 sovereigns died in that trench before me, claiming territory through destruction alone, Izuku said. I started doing the math somewhere around the 3rd week of this kingdom's existence. Every threat I meet with destruction is a threat I've taught myself to solve only one way. Every threat I meet with something else, mercy, negotiation, a genuine attempt to understand what's actually driving the hunger, is a threat I might be able to solve permanently instead of just postponing until the next swarm arrives hungrier and angrier than the last one. That's not how heroes are usually taught to think, Ryukyu said, something thoughtful and faintly startled in her voice. No, Izuku agreed. It's how I used to write in my old notebooks, back when I thought analyzing a quirk's mechanics was the only kind of pattern worth chasing. I think I'm only now understanding that the patterns worth chasing were never just about quirks at all. They were about understanding what a person, or a creature, or a swarm, actually needs underneath whatever threat they're presenting on the surface. The surface heroes I grew up watching solved problems by hitting them until the problem stopped moving. I don't think that's the only kind of strength worth having down here. I'm not sure it ever was, even up there. Sirius, drifting close enough to have heard the entire exchange, felt something warm settle behind her ribs, a feeling she had not yet found language precise enough to fully name, though she suspected, turning the feeling over carefully in the privacy of her own thoughts, that the word she was avoiding rhymed uncomfortably close with something she had not expected to feel this soon. For someone whose shape no longer resembled anything the surface would recognize as conventionally human at all. She said nothing of it that evening. But she found herself swimming closer to his vast, scaled flank than strictly necessary on the slow return to the central chamber, and if Izuku noticed, he said nothing either, except to adjust his own vast bulk, slightly, unconsciously, to leave her an easier current to swim within. Chapter 17. The Commission learned of the Scuttler swarm's defeat through channels considerably less reliable than they would have preferred, a series of fragmented sonar anomalies picked up by a deep-sea research vessel conducting unrelated survey work nearly 60 kilometers from the basin, anomalies that, once properly analyzed weeks later, painted a picture disturbing enough to prompt Director Sakaki's second emergency review in as many months. The entity's territory is expanding its influence, an analyst reported, projecting a crude reconstruction of the sonar data across the review room's main screen, a smeared, indistinct shape that conveyed scale without any useful detail. Whatever combat occurred at this location displaced enough water and biomass to register on instruments 60 kilometers distant. If the Midoriya entity is now actively engaging and apparently subduing other deep-sea threats, we are looking at something considerably beyond an isolated anomaly, Director. We may be looking at the early formation of an entirely new ecological hierarchy in international waters, one with no existing legal framework for classification, containment, or diplomatic engagement. Diplomatic engagement, Sakaki repeated, with the particular flat skepticism he reserved for phrases that sounded, to his ear, considerably more academic than practical. You're suggesting we negotiate with it? I'm suggesting, the analyst said carefully, that the alternative, continuing to treat this as a pure containment problem, has produced exactly 0 actionable containment options in 3 months of trying. Every conventional deep-sea tracking asset we've deployed has failed to maintain contact past the outer edge of whatever territory the entity controls. We do not know its full capabilities. We do not know the extent of its territory. We do not, frankly, know whether it would even be possible to contain something of this scale if it chose, at any point, to stop tolerating our continued surveillance attempts. Sakaki was quiet for a long moment, studying the smeared sonar image with an expression that, for the first time in the review's proceedings, carried something other than bureaucratic confidence. What would diplomatic engagement actually look like? He asked finally. A formal contact attempt, the analyst said. Conducted by representatives the entity has already demonstrated some willingness to communicate with, given the existing relationship with Captain Ryukyu and the asset designated Sirius. If both heroes have genuinely relocated permanently, as appears increasingly likely given their continued absence, then we already possess, through them, the only verified communication channel into this entity's territory that exists anywhere in our current intelligence picture. Severing that channel through continued hostile containment posturing would be, in my professional assessment, an extraordinary intelligence failure. You're suggesting we ask Ryukyu to act as an intermediary, Sakaki said. The same Ryukyu currently absent from agency duty under circumstances this commission has not yet fully resolved. I'm suggesting, the analyst said, with the particular careful diplomacy of someone delivering an unwelcome truth to a superior who outranked him considerably, that Captain Ryukyu may currently understand this entity's intentions and capabilities better than every analyst in this building combined, and that continuing to treat her absence as a disciplinary problem rather than an intelligence asset is, respectfully, a strategic error this commission cannot afford to keep making. Sakaki did not respond immediately, and in the silence that followed, several of the room's other occupants exchanged glances that suggested the analyst's blunt assessment, while professionally risky, had not actually surprised anyone present nearly as much as the room's careful, formal atmosphere implied it should have. Draft a contact proposal, Sakaki said finally. Something that doesn't use the word containment anywhere in its text. I want language that sounds like an invitation, not a summons. If there's any chance at all of opening genuine communication with whatever this entity has actually become, I would rather attempt that now, on terms we control, than wait until circumstances force a far less controlled conversation later. Chapter 18. The contact attempt arrived 8 days later, not through any official commission channel, but exactly the way Ryukyu had once described to Izuku as the only safe method of reaching the surface without inviting institutional surveillance, something small, unremarkable, washed ashore on a stretch of coastline far from any major search effort, a sealed waterproof capsule containing a single printed letter and nothing else. No tracking device, no transmitter, nothing that Ryukyu's careful Inspection. Once the capsule reached her through a network of contacts she had spent considerable effort rebuilding outside official agency channels, could identify as anything other than exactly what it claimed to be. She read it twice before bringing it to Izuku, partly to ensure she understood its actual content correctly, and partly because some old, instinctive caution refused to let her simply trust a commission communication at face value without first stress testing every line for the kind of careful manipulation she had learned, over 20 years, that institutions of this kind rarely failed to embed in even their most apparently sincere overtures. "It's from Sakaki," she told Izuku, once she had finally decided the letter contained nothing she needed to filter before sharing. "He's requesting contact. Not extraction. Not surrender. He's asking whether you'd be willing to establish some form of ongoing communication, on terms you set, regarding what he's calling, and I'm quoting directly here, the entity's relationship to international maritime jurisdiction going forward. That's considerably more careful language than the man who called my existence a public safety threat 3 months ago," Izuku observed. "People get careful when they realize threatening something hasn't actually worked," Ryukyu said. "I don't think Sakaki's grown a conscience, Izuku. I think his analysts finally convinced him that containment was never a realistic option, and that leaves him with exactly 2 choices, pretend you don't exist and hope nothing forces the issue, or actually try to negotiate with you before something forces it on terms considerably worse than the ones he could currently offer." Izuku considered the letter for a long time, turning the careful, formal language over with the same patient analysis he had once given a notebook full of Quirk diagrams, searching for the gap between what the words said and what the institution actually wanted. "What do you think I should do?" he asked finally, and something in the question carried a vulnerability Ryukyu had not heard from him in weeks, the old uncertainty of a boy who had once needed a stadium's worth of validation just to believe he deserved to stand among heroes at all. "I think," Ryukyu said carefully, "that you've already proven you don't need their permission to exist, or to build, or to protect what's yours. This letter isn't an offer of permission. It's an acknowledgement that they no longer have any leverage to withhold it. The question isn't whether you need to respond. The question is whether responding gets you something you actually want." "What would I want from them?" Izuku asked, half rhetorical, working through the question as he spoke it. "Recognition, maybe," Sirius offered, drifting into the conversation from the chamber's threshold, having overheard enough to want to weigh in. "Not their approval. You're right that you don't need that anymore. But maybe some kind of formal boundary, something that keeps them from sending another containment attempt every time a sonar anomaly spooks an analyst. If they're genuinely willing to negotiate terms instead of issuing demands, that's not nothing. That's the first time in 3 months they've treated you like a sovereign instead of a malfunction." Izuku turned that over for a long moment, the bioluminescent pulse along his spine settling into the slow, thoughtful rhythm Ryukyu had learned to associate with genuine deliberation rather than mere calculation. "I'll respond," he said finally. "But not with surrender, and not with the kind of vague diplomatic language that lets them quietly walk back every commitment the moment it becomes inconvenient. I want specific terms. No further surveillance attempts within the basin's outer boundary. No further containment planning treated as an active contingency. And formal acknowledgement, in writing, that whatever choices Ryukyu and Sirius have made about where they live now were made freely, without coercion, and remain entirely their own to make." "That's a good start," Ryukyu said, something warm and proud moving behind the words that surprised her with its own intensity. "What do they get, in exchange?" "Stability," Izuku said. "A kingdom that has no interest in conflict with the surface, as long as the surface extends the same courtesy in return. I've spent 3 months learning that destruction is rarely the wisest answer to a threat. I'd like to extend the same patience to the surface, if they're finally willing to earn it." The letter Izuku eventually composed, dictated carefully to Ryukyu over the better part of an evening and transcribed by her own hand onto waterproof paper salvaged from the response vessel's old emergency supplies, was shorter than the Commission's original overture, and considerably more direct, but it carried, threaded through every careful line, the unmistakable voice of someone who had finally stopped needing anyone's permission to know exactly what he wanted, and exactly what he was no longer willing to accept. Ryukyu delivered it herself, surfacing briefly near the same stretch of coastline where the Commission's original letter had washed ashore, trusting the tide to carry it the rest of the way toward whatever careful, monitored channel would eventually return it to Sakaki's desk, and then submerging again, swiftly, before any waiting surveillance asset could confirm more than a brief, ambiguous shape breaking the surface and vanishing again into deep water no sonar could meaningfully follow. Chapter 19. Sakaki's response, when it finally came 11 days later, surprised Ryukyu considerably more than she expected it to. He had agreed to every term, in writing, with a formality that suggested either genuine capitulation or careful legal maneuvering designed to look like capitulation while preserving some hidden loophole. Ryukyu spent the better part of a day searching for and, somewhat reluctantly, failed to find. The Commission would cease active surveillance within the basin's claimed boundary. Containment contingency planning would be formally shelved, pending future review only if the entity's behavior demonstrated active hostility toward surface populations, a standard considerably more reasonable than anything the original containment memo had proposed. And in a final paragraph that Ryukyu read 3 times before fully trusting its plain meaning, the Commission formally acknowledged that both Ryukyu and Sirius had relocated by their own free choice, with no coercion or undue influence involved, a statement that amounted, in practice, to the Commission quietly abandoning any further pretense that either hero remained subject to agency discipline for a decision already, irreversibly, made. There was one additional element to Sakaki's response that neither the Commission's formal letter nor Ryukyu's careful analysis of it had anticipated, a second, smaller, separately sealed envelope, addressed not to Izuku, and not to Ryukyu, but specifically, in handwriting Izuku recognized instantly with a jolt that ran through his entire vast frame, to him, in the name he had not heard spoken aloud, by anyone who mattered, in over 3 months. Izuku, the envelope read, in his mother's unmistakable handwriting, and beneath it, smaller, almost an afterthought, but no less devastating for its brevity, I know they can't promise me you're safe. I'm asking anyway, because a mother doesn't stop needing to ask just because the answer might not be the one she wants to hear. Izuku did not open the letter for nearly an hour, holding it instead in claws built for crushing collapsing platforms with a delicacy that struck Ryukyu, watching from a respectful distance, as one of the most quietly devastating things she had witnessed in the entire 3 months she had known him in this new, vast shape. How, he finally asked, his voice carrying a rawness Ryukyu had not heard from him since the diagnostic ward conversation he had once described to her in halting, painful fragments. How did they even know to include this? I never told Sakaki anything about wanting to reach her. I think, Ryukyu said gently, that whatever else is true about that man, he spent 3 months learning that the surest way to actually negotiate with you is to stop treating you like a threat and start treating you like a person who lost things he's still grieving. Someone on his staff finally did the obvious thing. They asked your mother if she wanted to send something, and she said yes immediately, the way I imagine she's been waiting to say yes since the day you disappeared. Izuku opened the letter at last, alone, in a quiet corner of the gardens where the bioluminescent blooms cast slow, gentle light across the water, and Ryukyu and Sirius, sensing the moment required privacy neither of them had any right to intrude upon, withdrew to the central chamber to wait. He returned an hour later, the letter folded with careful precision and tucked, somehow, into some fold of scale near where a human heart might once have beaten, and though his vast, ancient face carried no expression a surface mind could easily read, something in the slow, steady pulse of his bioluminescent markings told both women, instantly, that whatever the letter had contained, it had given him something he badly needed. She's not asking me to come back, he said quietly. She just wants to know I'm not in pain. She wants to know if I'm happy. She says she always knew, somehow, that I was meant for something the ordinary world wasn't built to hold, even before any of this happened, and that she spent 3 months telling herself that whatever I'd become, I was still her son underneath it, and that she trusts me to know what's actually best for the boy she raised, even if the shape that boy wears now doesn't look anything like the one she tucked into bed every night for 16 years. Are you happy? Sirius asked, quiet, careful, because the question mattered too much to ask carelessly. Izuku was quiet for a long moment, his ancient eye drifting across the gardens, the towers, the slow patient warmth of a kingdom built from nothing but instinct and hope and a refusal to accept that the only available shape for his life was a cage with good lighting. Yes, he said finally, And something in the single word carried more total certainty than Ryukyu had heard from him in any of their 3 months together. I'm happy. I built something the surface told me was impossible, and I built it honestly, and I didn't have to hurt anyone to do it, and the 2 people who chose to stand beside me chose it with open eyes, the same way I chose this kingdom with open eyes. I don't think I've ever been able to say that about my life before. Not once, not even on my best days on the surface, when everything looked, from the outside, like it was finally going right. I'll write her back, he said, after a moment, something resolved settling into his voice. Not everything yet. I'm not ready to explain all of this in a single letter, and I don't think she needs the full weight of it all at once. But I want her to know I'm happy. I want her to know that, whatever else changes, that part isn't going to stop being true. Ryukyu watched him compose the reply that evening, dictating it slowly to her once again, his vast claws too large and too clumsy for the delicate work of actual handwriting, and she found herself, transcribing his careful, halting words onto the same waterproof paper, thinking that she had perhaps never witnessed anything quite so strange and quite so moving as a colossal, ancient sea sovereign, capable of holding a collapsing oil platform steady with one limb, painstakingly choosing each word of a letter meant to comfort his own worried mother, 3 months and an entire ocean away from the boy she remembered raising. Chapter 20. News of the Scuttler Treaty and the Broodmother's reformed swarm spread through the deep currents in ways Izuku had not anticipated, carried not through any language he fully understood but through the same old, patient pressure network the Tide Warden had spent weeks teaching him to read, a kind of ambient information current that the ocean's older residents seemed to treat as simple common knowledge. The way surface gossip moved through a small town's market square. He learned this firsthand on the 13th week, when a creature he had never encountered before, slow and ponderous and covered in what looked, at first glance, like an armor of fused, ancient shells, surfaced at the kingdom's eastern boundary requesting, in halting, careful pressure pulses, an audience. I have heard of the sovereign who shares rather than consumes, the creature said, once Izuku had granted it passage into the gardens, its vast, shelled bulk settling cautiously near the perimeter as though still unconvinced the invitation was genuine. I did not believe the current tales when they first reached my reef. Sovereigns do not share. It is not in the nature of territory to be offered rather than defended. And yet you came anyway, Izuku observed. Because my reef is dying, the creature admitted, something raw and desperate moving beneath the careful formality of its pressure language. A current shift 3 seasons ago redirected the warm water my people depended on. We have watched our home grow colder and barer with each passing season, and every sovereign we have approached for aid has named a price we could not pay: territory, tribute, submission. I came because the current tales said you named no such price for the Scuttlers. I came to learn whether the tales were true, or whether they were simply a kinder story this ocean tells itself because the truth is too bleak to bear repeating. Ryukyu, present for the exchange, felt something tighten in her chest at the rawness of the admission, the particular desperate honesty of a creature that had clearly exhausted every other option before risking this one. How many in your reef? Izuku asked. Several hundred, the creature said. Mostly elder and young. The strength of our reef left long ago, scattered to currents that could still support them. Those of us who remain are the ones who could not bear to leave the dead behind, or could not survive the journey to anywhere else. Izuku was quiet for a long moment, turning the request over with the same careful, total attention he had given the Broodmother's hunger weeks earlier, and Ryukyu, watching him think, understood that whatever answer he reached would shape the kingdom's character considerably more permanently than any single battle had. Show me your reef, he said finally. I won't promise anything until I understand what's actually being asked of the gardens, and what helping you would actually cost the things already living here. But I won't refuse to even look, when the alternative is letting several hundred elders and children die of a cold I might have the power to warm. The journey to the dying reef took the better part of a day, Izuku and Ryukyu moving together through colder, darker water than the basin's familiar warmth, and what they found, when they finally arrived, struck even Ryukyu's considerable accumulated experience with disaster response as something close to genuinely heartbreaking. A vast coral structure that had clearly once teemed with color and life, now bleached and brittle and silent except for the slow, labored movement of the creatures too old or too young to have fled when the warm current shifted away. Izuku spent 3 days at the dying reef before he fully understood the engineering problem in front of him, tracing the cold current's new path with the same patient attention the Tide Warden had taught him to bring to the deep ocean's vast circulation systems, and on the 4th day, he began, carefully, to carve. He did not redirect the warm bent water from his own gardens, understanding immediately that doing so would simply transfer the dying reef's crisis onto his own kingdom's flourishing one. Instead he found, after considerable searching, a separate vent system nearly 40 kilometers from the reef, dormant and unclaimed, and spent the better part of 2 weeks carving a channel through solid rock to redirect its warmth toward the dying coral, a project that would have taken human engineering crews years and that he completed, working largely alone while Ryukyu and Sirius maintained the kingdom's gardens in his absence, in considerably less time than even he had expected. The reef did not recover overnight. Coral grew slowly, even coral fed by deliberately redirected volcanic warmth, and Izuku understood, watching the first faint hints of returning color bloom along the reef's outer edges weeks later, that the true measure of his help would only become visible across seasons rather than days. But the elders and the young who remained no longer faced a cold, dying current with no recourse. They faced, instead, a slow, patient warmth, and the particular fragile hope that came from watching a sovereign choose to help simply because help was needed, with no tribute demanded in return. You could have asked for something, the shelled creature told him, once the channel's warmth had finally, fully reached the reef's furthest edges. Most sovereigns would have territory, allegiance, some claim on our reef's future loyalty. You asked for nothing. I didn't help you to be owed anything, Izuku said. I helped because watching a reef die when I had the power to prevent it would have made me exactly the kind of sovereign I left the surface to stop becoming. Word of the reef's rescue traveled the deep currents faster even than the Scuttler Treaty had, and in the weeks that followed, Izuku found himself, with some private bewilderment, fielding an increasing number of careful, hopeful approaches from creatures and small communities scattered across a steadily widening radius of ocean floor, none of them demanding anything, most of them simply curious, cautiously testing whether the current tales of a sovereign who shared rather than consumed had finally found their way to a kingdom worth believing in. I think we're becoming something bigger than a kingdom, Sirius observed one evening, watching a small delegation of luminous eels depart after a brief, friendly exchange about water temperature regulation near their own modest territory, 3 ridges distant from the basin's main gardens. I think we might be becoming the first thing this part of the ocean has ever had that looks something like a community. Is that all right? Izuku asked, something cautious in the question, as though the scale of what he had apparently begun building still occasionally caught him by surprise. I think it's better than all right, Ryukyu said. I think it might be exactly what you were always going to build, the moment you decided strength should mean something other than the right to take whatever you wanted from anything weaker than you. I don't think this was ever going to stay small, Izuku. I think you built something that was always going to grow into whatever this is becoming, the same way a single warm current eventually reshapes an entire reef. Chapter 21. The first true test of the kingdom's growing reputation as something more than a single sovereign's private domain arrived in the 14th week, not as a threat, but as a delegation, 3 deep-sea elder creatures of considerable age and evident standing, none of whom Izuku had previously encountered, arriving with the same cautious formality the shelled creature had shown weeks earlier, though these 3 carried themselves with a gravity that suggested considerably more at stake than a single dying reef. We have come on behalf of the Deep Current Council, the eldest of the 3 said, a vast, ancient ray-like creature whose wings, fully extended, easily spanned the width of the central chamber's entrance. You may not have heard of us. We do not often involve ourselves in the affairs of young sovereigns, having learned, across considerable accumulated age, that most young claimants burn brightly and fail within a handful of seasons, and that involving ourselves in their brief, violent rises and falls accomplishes little beyond wasted effort. You're here because I haven't failed yet, Izuku observed. You are here, the Elder Ray corrected, because you have done something none of us anticipated, and the council finds itself, after considerable debate, uncertain whether what you represent is opportunity or threat, and uncertain enough that we agreed, collectively, the uncertainty itself demanded direct investigation rather than continued distant observation. Ryukyu, present for the exchange alongside Sirius, felt the particular weight of the moment settle over the chamber, understanding, Even before the Elder Ray continued, that whatever judgment this council reached would likely shape the kingdom's relationship with the wider deep ocean for considerably longer than any single treaty or rescued reef. Explain the uncertainty, Izuku said, careful, measured, the old habit of seeking full information before committing to any response settling over him with practiced ease. You have built faster than any sovereign in living memory, the Elder Ray said. You have claimed territory through mercy rather than conquest, a pattern this council has observed perhaps 3 times across an accumulated age longer than your kind has any framework to measure. You have begun attracting smaller communities into a loose orbit around your kingdom, not through coercion, but through simple, voluntary trust, a pattern the council finds, frankly, almost without precedent. Some among us believe you represent the first genuine opportunity in ages for the deep ocean's scattered, vulnerable communities to finally have something resembling protection and stability. Others believe you represent precisely the kind of concentrated, rapidly accumulating power that has, throughout this ocean's long history, eventually curdled into exactly the kind of tyranny you claim to have fled the surface to avoid building. That's a fair concern, Izuku said, without defensiveness, absorbing the weight of the accusation with the same careful honesty he had once offered the Tidewarden's initial challenge. I can't prove to you, in a single conversation, that I'll never become what you're afraid of. I can only tell you what I've chosen so far, and ask you to judge the pattern rather than the fear. Then tell us, the Elder Ray said, and Izuku, drawing on the accumulated experience of 14 weeks building, negotiating, and protecting a kingdom that had grown considerably beyond his original, solitary intentions, told them everything, the Scuttler Treaty negotiated through mercy rather than destruction, the dying reef rescued without tribute demanded in return, the careful, deliberate restraint he had shown even when the Tidewarden's own testing had given him every justification to simply overwhelm a challenge through raw force rather than patient strategy. The council deliberated for the better part of 2 days, withdrawing to confer privately in the deep trench beyond the basin's boundary while Izuku, Ryukyu, and Sirius waited in the kind of tense, uncertain quiet that came from understanding a judgment was being made about them that they had no power to directly influence any further. We have reached a decision, the Elder Ray said, when the council finally returned. The Deep Current Council does not often extend recognition to young sovereigns. We have done so perhaps a dozen times across an age longer than this conversation has time to fully describe. We extend it to you now, conditionally, with the understanding that recognition can be withdrawn as readily as it is granted, should the pattern you have shown us thus far prove, eventually, to have been a temporary performance rather than a genuine character. What does recognition actually grant me? Izuku asked. Standing, the Elder Ray said. Voice, in matters that affect the deep ocean's wider community. And, should you ever require it, the Council's support against threats considerably larger than any single sovereign, even one of your evident scale, could reasonably face alone. We do not offer this lightly. We offer it because the alternative, watching potential of this magnitude go unsupported and unguided, strikes this Council, after considerable debate, as a greater risk than the one we accept by extending you our trust. Izuku absorbed the weight of the offer slowly, understanding, with the same careful analytical attention he brought to every significant decision, that this moment marked something considerably larger than a single negotiated treaty or a single rescued reef. This was the deep ocean itself, ancient and patient and rarely impressed by anything, choosing to extend him a kind of legitimacy no surface institution had ever offered without first demanding he prove himself useful on terms entirely defined by someone else. I accept, he said. And I'll spend however many seasons it takes proving the Council's trust wasn't misplaced. See that you do, the Elder Ray said, something that might, in a creature capable of warmer expression, have been the ghost of approval. The ocean has buried more failed sovereigns than it has crowned successful ones. We would prefer, this time, to have guessed correctly. The Council's departure left the central chamber quiet in a way that felt, to Ryukyu, considerably different from the kingdom's usual peaceful stillness, awaited, settling quiet, the particular silence of people who had just watched something significant shift permanently beneath their feet. You're not just a sovereign anymore, she said finally, breaking the silence. You're becoming something the deep ocean actually recognizes as legitimate. That's not nothing, Izuku. That's not even close to nothing. I know, Izuku said, And something in his voice carried equal parts wonder and quiet apprehension, the particular weight of someone beginning to understand that the thing he had built for 3 people in the dark had somehow, without his fully noticing the transition, become something considerably larger than the 3 of them, something with responsibilities and consequences that extended now toward creatures and communities he had never met and might never personally encounter. "Does that frighten you?" Sirius asked, gentle, perceptive, having learned over 14 weeks to read the particular textures of his uncertainty even through a face built from scale rather than flesh. "A little," Izuku admitted. "I left the surface because I didn't want to be responsible for living up to anyone else's expectations of what my strength should mean. I think some part of me is realizing, watching that council leave, that I haven't actually escaped that responsibility. I've just traded one version of it for another, one I happen to believe in considerably more than the version the surface tried to assign me." "Is that so different?" Ryukyu asked, gently. "Believing in the responsibility, instead of resenting it. It's the only difference that's ever actually mattered," Izuku said, after a long moment, something settling and resolving in his vast, ancient expression. "I think that's the entire answer, actually. Not whether power comes with responsibility. It always does, on the surface or beneath it. The only real choice anyone ever gets is whether the responsibility feels like a cage, or like a kingdom worth building. I spent 16 years on the surface being handed the first kind. I think I'd like to spend whatever comes next building considerably more of the second." Chapter 22. The council's recognition, as it turned out, carried consequences neither Izuku nor either of his queens had fully anticipated, chief among them the attention of precisely the kind of sovereign the council itself had warned might eventually test a young claimant's resolve. He arrived on the kingdom's 15th week without any of the careful diplomatic formality the shelled creature or the Elder Rays delegation had observed, a vast, armored shape cutting through the basin's outer current with the deliberate, unhurried arrogance of something that had never once needed to ask permission for anything it wanted, trailed by a retinue of lesser deep dwellers whose posture, even at a distance, carried the particular cowed deference of subjects rather than allies. Ryukyu felt the wrongness of his approach before she saw him clearly, a cold, predatory pressure entirely different from the Tidewarden's ancient gravity or the council's careful formality, something that radiated, instead, the casual confidence of a creature accustomed to taking whatever it wanted and facing no consequence for the taking. "I am Maelgrave," the creature announced, once it had settled at the basin's edge, its vast, barnacle-crusted bulk dwarfing even the towers in its immediate vicinity, though it remained, Ryukyu noted with some relief, smaller than Izuku's own full colossal scale. "I have ruled the southern trench network for longer than your kind has existed, young sovereign, and I have grown tired of hearing current tales of a upstart claiming legitimacy through soft mercy and borrowed council recognition. I have come to settle, personally, whether the tales exaggerate your strength, or whether they have, for once, told the truth." Izuku regarded the newcomer with the same careful, analytical attention he brought to every threat, cataloging posture and bulk and the particular tells of a creature accustomed to intimidation rather than genuine combat experience. "I have no quarrel with the southern trench," he said. "I built nothing that encroaches on your territory. I don't see what settling anything between us actually requires." "It requires settling," Maelgrave said, with the flat, total certainty of something that had never once needed to justify its own demands, because soft sovereigns who rule through mercy rather than conquest make the rest of us look weak by comparison, and weakness invites challenge from creatures considerably less patient than I have chosen to be in approaching you directly rather than simply absorbing your territory while you slept. I am doing you a courtesy, in fact, offering you the chance to submit your kingdom to my authority before I am forced to take it through means considerably less courteous." Sirius, listening from beside Ryukyu, felt the particular cold anger that came from recognizing, instantly and completely, the same casual entitlement that had characterized every commission official who had ever spoken about Izuku's existence as something requiring management rather than respect, the same assumption that softness and mercy constituted weakness rather than a different, harder one kind of strength. "I'm not going to submit anything," Izuku said, simple, direct, without any particular heat in the refusal, only the calm, settled certainty of someone who had spent 15 weeks learning exactly how much he was willing to defend and exactly how little patience he had left for creatures who mistook his restraint for an absence of capability. Then we settle it the old way, Maelgrave said, something eager and violent kindling behind his ancient, armored eyes, the particular hunger of a creature that had clearly been hoping, all along, for exactly this answer. The battle that followed tested Izuku more severely than the Scuttler Swarm or even the Tidewarden's careful trials, Maelgrave fighting with none of the structured testing the Tidewarden had offered, only raw, accumulated brutality honed across an age of uncontested southern dominance, armored limbs crashing against Izuku's scaled flank with enough force to crack stone towers 200 meters distant, currents weaponized into crushing vortices that Maelgrave clearly expected to overwhelm a younger, less experienced opponent through sheer accumulated violence alone. Izuku took the early exchanges carefully, absorbing damage he could have avoided in order to study the older sovereign's patterns, the same patient, analytical approach that had once filled notebooks with Quirk diagrams now applied to a creature whose every devastating strike, Izuku noted with growing confidence, telegraphed itself a fraction of a second before landing. The predictable habit of something that had faced no genuine challenge in so long it had stopped bothering to vary its attacks. You fight like something that's never lost, Izuku observed, weathering a crushing blow that sent fractures spiraling across two of his ribbed plates, because nothing has ever made you afraid of losing. Fear is for the weak, Maelgrave snarled, already winding up for another strike. Fear is for anything smart enough to know it isn't invincible, Izuku corrected, and as the next blow came, he did not absorb it. He moved, precisely, the fraction of a degree the Tidewarden had taught him weeks earlier, redirecting Maelgrave's own crushing momentum past him rather than through him, and the older sovereign, overcommit and suddenly unbalanced for what was clearly the first time in longer than he could comfortably remember, crashed into the basin floor with a force that cracked bedrock for 30 meters in every direction. Izuku did not press the advantage with killing intent. He simply settled his full, colossal weight across Maelgrave's exposed flank, the same careful, total containment he had used on the broodmother weeks earlier, holding rather than crushing, and waited, patient, for the older sovereign's furious thrashing to finally, gradually exhaust itself. This doesn't have to end in either of our deaths, Izuku said, once Maelgrave's struggling had slowed enough to suggest the message might actually land. You came here assuming softness meant weakness. I'm offering you the chance to leave having learned otherwise, without either of us paying the price conquest usually demands. Why, Maelgrave snarled, still defiant despite his position, would you offer mercy to something that came here intending to take everything you built? Because I'd rather spend my strength building something the deep ocean trusts than spend it making enemies out of every sovereign too proud to admit a younger claimant beat him fairly, Izuku said. You can leave now, with your territory intact and your pride considerably more bruised than your body, or you can keep fighting until one of us doesn't get back up. I'd genuinely rather you chose the first option, Maelgrave. Not because I'm afraid of the second. Because I think this ocean has buried enough sovereigns already, and I'm tired of adding to the count when there's another way available. Maelgrave was silent for a long, charged moment, the fury in his ancient eyes warring visibly with something that looked, to Ryukyu's careful observation, almost like genuine bewilderment, the particular disorientation of a creature encountering a kind of strength it had no existing framework to properly categorize. No one has ever offered me that choice before, he admitted finally, something grudging and uncertain in the words. Every challenger I have ever faced fought to the death, because every challenger believed, as I once believed, that mercy shown to a defeated rival simply invited that rival's eventual revenge. I'm betting it doesn't have to, Izuku said. I'm betting that a sovereign who's been shown mercy once might actually remember it, the next time he's deciding whether the ocean has room for more than one kind of strength. Izuku released him slowly, and Maelgrave, free at last, did not immediately attack again, instead studying Izuku with an attention that had shifted, perceptibly, from contemptuous challenge into something far more careful and considerably more curious. I will return to my trench, Maelgrave said finally. I make no promises about what I will tell the other southern sovereigns who will ask why I returned without your territory. But I find myself, against considerable inclination, curious whether the current tales were exaggerating after all, or whether they actually undersold what you've built down here. He withdrew, eventually, trailing his retinue back toward the southern trenches, and Ryukyu, watching the vast, armored shape recede into the deep dark, found herself thinking that the encounter had cost Izuku considerably more in damage than the Scuttler Swarm or even the Tidewarden's trials, and had earned him, in exchange, something she suspected would prove worth every cracked plate by the time its full value became clear. "You're bleeding," Sirius said, the moment Maelgrave's retinue had fully vanished from sight, her voice carrying the particular sharp worry of someone who had spent the entire battle forcing herself to trust his strategy rather than intervene. "I'll heal," Izuku said, though the careful way he settled his vast bulk against the basin floor suggested the healing would take considerably longer than either of his queens found entirely comfortable to watch unfold. "Was it worth it?" Ryukyu asked. "Showing him mercy, when he came here intending to simply take everything we've built?" "I don't know yet," Izuku admitted. "I won't know for certain until I see what he actually does with the choice I gave him. But I know what the alternative would have cost. Either his death, which would have made an enemy of every sovereign loyal to him across the entire southern trench network, or mine, which I'm considerably less interested in risking than I am interested in betting that mercy, shown carefully and without naivety, might actually be the stronger long-term strategy. I think I'd rather be the kind of sovereign who bets on that, even when betting wrong costs me something. I think that's still better than being the kind who never bets on anything except force, because force is simply easier to trust." Chapter 23. The kingdom's 12th week brought no further crisis, no swarm, no commission overture, only the slow, accumulating rhythm of a life the three of them had each, in their own time, finally chosen without reservation, and it was in the quiet of that rare, settled peace that Ryukyu finally found the words for something she had been turning over privately for considerably longer than she had let herself admit. She found Izuku alone in the gardens, near the spiraling coral bloom he had spent weeks adjusting until its color held exactly the tone he wanted, and she settled beside him in dragon form, watching the slow bioluminescent pulse of the bloom in companionable silence for several long minutes before finally speaking. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and you don't have to answer if the question feels like too much." "Always," he said, the same simple, total openness he had offered every difficult question either woman had brought him in 3 months of careful, accumulating trust. "What are we to you?" she asked. "Not titles. Not roles. I know the surface would probably try to flatten this into something simple, guardians, subjects, whatever language makes the strangeness easier to file away into a category they already understand. I want to know what you actually think we are, in whatever words feel true to you, even if those words don't fit any category the surface has a name for." Izuku was quiet for a long time, the ancient eye drifting toward the slow, patient light of the gardens he had built from nothing, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a careful, deliberate weight that told Ryukyu he had given the question more thought, in private, than she had realized. "I think you're the first people who ever chose me without needing me to be useful first," he said. "Everyone on the surface loved me conditionally, even the people who loved me sincerely. My mother loved me unconditionally, but even she spent 16 years afraid for me, because the world made it clear, over and over, that a boy without power had no safe place in it. All Might believed in me, but the belief came wrapped in expectations I spent a year and a half breaking my own bones trying to meet. Every kindness I received on the surface, even the most genuine ones, arrived with some invisible condition attached: be useful, be grateful, be smaller than what you actually are so the rest of us don't have to reckon with the size of you. You didn't choose me that way," he continued, after a moment. "You chose me after I'd already become something the surface called a threat. You chose me knowing exactly how strange this life would be, knowing there was no glory in it, no commission ranking, no public recognition, nothing except the honest, unglamorous work of building something real in the dark. I think that makes you the first people in my entire life who loved me, or whatever this is, without any condition attached at all. I don't have a single word for what that makes you. I've thought about it for weeks and I haven't found one that feels big enough." Ryukyu felt something in her chest tighten and release in the same breath, an old, guarded ache she had carried since long before this kingdom existed finally finding, after 20 years, somewhere honest to settle. "Queens," Sirius offered quietly, having drifted close enough to hear the last of the exchange without either of them noticing her arrival. "That's the word the old stories would have used, isn't it? Sovereigns don't rule alone, in the stories that actually understood power. They rule beside people who chose them freely, and who they trust enough to rule beside in return. I don't think it's the surface's word. I think it might just be the oldest, truest word there is for exactly what you're describing. Izuku considered that for a long moment, something in his ancient, vast expression shifting into something that might, on a more conventional face, have been quiet, overwhelmed wonder. Queens of the Deep, he said slowly, testing the shape of the words. I think I'd like that. Not as a title either of you needs to earn or prove. Just as the truest word I have for what this already is. Then that's what we are, Ryukyu said, simple, certain, final, and serious, settling beside her with the easy comfort of someone who had finally, fully, stopped questioning whether this strange, impossible life was the right one, found herself smiling in a way she had not allowed herself to smile, freely and without reservation, in longer than she could clearly remember. Above them, far beyond the thin, distant suggestion of surface light, the world continued exactly as it always had, heroes patrolling familiar streets, agencies measuring worth in rankings and photographs and carefully managed public approval, an entire society still operating on the old, narrow assumption that strength existed to serve usefulness and nothing more. Below, in a kingdom built from instinct and patience and a refusal to accept that the only available shape for an extraordinary life was a cage with good lighting, 3 sovereigns settled into the slow, warm pulse of a garden that asked nothing of any of them except that they continue, exactly as they already were, to be real. The kingdom had no name yet. None of them, in 3 months, had felt any particular urgency to give it one. But it had towers, and warm water gardens, and ancient guardians who had chosen, freely, to defend what had been built rather than simply outlast it, and it had, at its quiet, patient heart, a colossal, unstoppable sovereign who had once been told he had nothing inside him worth protecting, surrounded now by everything he had built, and everyone who had chosen, with open eyes, to help him build it. It was enough. It had always, from the very first night he climbed out of a dormitory window toward a titline he could not yet fully explain, been enough. It simply needed, after 16 years of being told otherwise, someone patient enough to finally believe it. Chapter 24. The first sign that something larger than any threat the kingdom had yet faced was stirring arrived not through the deep current network, and not through any commission letter, but through the Tidewarden itself, surfacing at the basin's southern boundary on the 16th week with an urgency that struck Izuku, the moment he felt it approaching, as entirely unlike the ancient creature's usual unhurried patience. You need to hear this directly, the Tidewarden said, without its customary slow formality, the moment Izuku had surfaced to meet it. I have lived in this trench longer than your kind has any framework to measure, and I have felt very little in that time that genuinely concerned me. I am concerned now. Ryukyu, arriving at Izuku's flank in dragon form, felt the weight of the Tidewarden's unusual urgency settle over her like a physical pressure. What is it? Izuku asked. There is a current shift building far to the east, the Tidewarden said, beyond even the boundaries of the Deep Current Council's furthest reach. I have felt shifts of this kind only twice before in my entire existence, both times preceding something the old current tales call a hollow tide, a migration event so vast it reshapes entire stretches of ocean floor in its passing. The last hollow tide I witnessed drowned 3 sovereign territories beneath a wave of displaced deep creatures fleeing something none of them survived long enough to identify clearly. I do not know yet what drives this one. I know only that the pressure building in the eastern current feels, to senses considerably older than yours, exactly like the pressure that preceded both prior hollow tides. What causes a hollow tide? Sirius asked, arriving in time to catch the tail end of the warning, her constellation patterns flickering with the particular tension that came from sensing danger before fully understanding its shape. No one alive remembers with certainty, the Tidewarden admitted. The old current tales describe something rising from depths even the deepest trenches do not reach, depths the ocean itself seems reluctant to acknowledge exist. Whatever it is, it does not hunt the way the scuttlers hunted, or challenge the way Maelgrave challenged. It simply rises, and everything in its path that cannot flee fast enough or fight hard enough is consumed or scattered, and the ocean floor itself bears the scar of its passing for ages afterward. Izuku absorbed the warning with the same careful, total focus he brought to every crisis, the analytical instinct that had once filled notebooks with Quirk diagrams now turning, methodically, toward a threat considerably larger and considerably less understood than anything he had previously faced. How long until it reaches us? He asked. I do not know, the Tidewarden said. The current pressure suggests weeks, perhaps a season, though the old tales are imprecise on timing in ways that frustrate even my own patience. I know only that the Deep Current Council will need to be warned, and that every sovereign and community within the Hollow Tide's eventual path will need considerably more warning than the last 3 territories it drowned ever received. The council convened within 4 days of the Tidewarden's warning reaching them, the Elder Ray and her fellow council members arriving with a gravity considerably heavier than their previous, cautiously formal visit, and Izuku, presenting the Tidewarden's warning alongside his own careful analysis of the current pressure readings he had spent the intervening days learning to interpret with growing fluency, watched the council's composure crack, for the first time since he had known them, into something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine fear. If the Tidewarden's reading is accurate, the Elder Ray said, once the full implications had settled over the gathered council, then every territory within perhaps 200 leagues of the eastern current faces displacement, destruction, or worse, within a season. This includes your own kingdom, young sovereign, and includes considerably more vulnerable communities scattered across that radius who possess nothing resembling your accumulated strength. What do we do? Ryukyu asked, the question carrying the particular weight of someone already calculating, instinctively, how to organize a defense against a threat she did not yet fully understand. We have never successfully stopped a hollow tide, the Elder Ray admitted. The old tales describe only survival through flight, scattered communities abandoning territory ahead of the migration's arrival and rebuilding, eventually, in its wake, once the tide had passed through and moved on to whatever destination drove its rising. That's not good enough, Izuku said, something hard and immediate entering his voice. I didn't build this kingdom so that the first real test of its strength would end with everyone scattering and hoping to rebuild eventually. There has to be another option. There may not be, the Elder Ray said, not unkindly, but with the particular weary honesty of someone who had watched ages of accumulated history confirm, repeatedly, the limits of even considerable strength against something this poorly understood. I would not ask you to risk everything you have built chasing a hope this thin, young sovereign. Flight, properly organized and warned well in advance, has saved considerably more lives across this ocean's history than false confidence ever has. Izuku was quiet for a long moment, turning the council's grim assessment over with the same patient analysis he had once given every threat the kingdom had faced, and Ryukyu, watching him think, understood that whatever decision he reached would shape not just the kingdom's immediate survival, but the entire character of what he had spent 16 weeks building. I need more information before I decide anything, he said finally. If no one currently alive has successfully studied what actually drives a hollow tide, then maybe the answer isn't fighting it, or fleeing it. Maybe the answer is finally understanding it well enough that one of those 2 options stops being the only choice available. The council's deliberation, before it finally dispersed to begin the difficult work of warning every territory within the projected radius, left one matter still unresolved, a question the Elder Ray raised carefully, near the end of the long, tense session, with the particular delicacy of someone broaching a subject she suspected might prove unwelcome. There is a precedent for what you are proposing, she said. Not a hopeful one. 3 sovereigns, across this council's considerable accumulated memory, attempted to study a hollow tide directly rather than simply warning their territories to flee. None survived the attempt. I do not say this to discourage you, young sovereign. I say it because I believe you deserve the full truth before you commit anyone, including yourself, to a path this council's own history suggests has only ever ended badly. What happened to them? Izuku asked, careful, steady, though something tightened briefly along his vast scaled flank that Ryukyu, watching closely, recognized as the particular stillness of someone absorbing a genuine warning rather than simply weighing an abstract risk. The first approached too closely, too soon, before properly understanding the displacement's true scale, the Elder Ray said. He was caught in the leading pressure wave and crushed before he could withdraw. The second attempted to communicate directly, the way you communicated with the Scuddler broodmother, assuming some shared intelligence might be reasoned with. Whatever drives a hollow tide, if anything resembling intelligence drives it at all, did not respond to that overture in any way our records preserved clearly, except that the second sovereign was never seen again. The third, wiser than the first 2, attempted only distant observation, exactly as you are proposing. She survived the attempt itself. She did not survive what came after, when the territory she had abandoned to study the tide more closely was claimed, in her absence, by rivals who had been waiting for exactly that vulnerability. Izuku absorbed the warning's full weight slowly, understanding that the council's grim history carried lessons considerably more specific than simple discouragement, lessons about timing, about distance, about the particular vulnerability that came from dividing attention between a distant, poorly understood threat and a kingdom that still required active, present defense. Then I won't make either of their mistakes, he said finally. I'll keep my distance until I actually understand the displacement's mechanics. And I won't leave the kingdom undefended while I study it. Ryukyu, Sirius, and the Tide Warden can maintain the basin's defenses in my absence, and I'll return between each expedition rather than committing to a single, extended observation that leaves everyone vulnerable the way it left your third sovereign vulnerable. That is, the Elder Ray said, after a long moment, a considerably wiser approach than either of the first two sovereigns managed. I will not pretend it eliminates the risk entirely. I will say that it is the first proposal in this council's memory that has actually accounted for the specific failures that doomed every previous attempt. Perhaps that improved caution will prove to be the difference this time. Ryukyu, once the council had finally dispersed and the basin had settled back into its familiar, watchful quiet, found Izuku alone near the central chamber's threshold, turning the Elder Ray's warning over with the same careful, methodical attention he gave every significant decision. You don't have to do this alone, she said, settling beside him. I know, he said. But I think the observation itself has to be done carefully, by someone who can move fast enough to withdraw the instant something goes wrong. I'm not trying to be a martyr about this, Ryukyu. I just think the math actually supports one of us taking the risk rather than all three, given how thin our defenses would stretch if we all left the basin exposed at once. That's not nothing to ask me to accept, she said. I know that too, Izuku admitted, something raw moving beneath the careful, analytical composure. I'm not asking you to be comfortable with it. I'm asking you to trust that I've thought through every angle I can think of, the same way I thought through the Scuttler Swarm, the same way I thought through Mailgrave. I came back from both of those. I intend to come back from this too. Ryukyu studied him for a long moment, weighing 20 years of disaster response instinct against 5 months of accumulated trust in exactly this kind of careful, deliberate courage, and finally, reluctantly, nodded. Come back from this one too, then, she said. That's not a request. That's an expectation. I don't think I've built enough of a life down here yet to know how to keep building it without you in it. I don't intend to find out either, Izuku said, quiet, certain, and turned, finally, toward the long, careful expedition that would, over the following weeks, reshape his understanding of exactly what kind of threat the deep ocean's oldest, least understood mysteries could still hold for even a sovereign of his considerable, hard-won strength. Chapter 25. The weeks that followed tested the kingdom's resources and resolve in ways no single battle, however brutal, had previously demanded, Izuku dividing his attention between continued analysis of the building current pressure, careful coordination with the Deep Current Council on contingency planning for the kingdom's most vulnerable residents, and an increasingly urgent series of expeditions toward the eastern current's leading edge, hoping to gather enough direct observation to finally understand what was actually approaching. Ryukyu took charge of the evacuation planning in his absence, drawing on 20 years of disaster response experience that translated, she found with some grim satisfaction, considerably more directly to deep ocean crisis management than she had initially expected. She organized the basin's smaller residents, the luminous fish Sirius had spent months teaching to recognize light signals, the reformed Scuttler Swarm, even a delegation from the once-dying reef Izuku had rescued months earlier, into a careful evacuation framework that prioritized the most vulnerable first, the eggs and young and elderly given the earliest possible warning and the clearest possible paths towards safer territory, should the hollow tide's approach ultimately prove unstoppable. Sirius, meanwhile, found herself increasingly valuable in a role she had not anticipated when she first descended into the kingdom's depths months earlier, her bioluminescent communication network, originally built simply to teach a handful of curious fish basic signals, expanding rapidly into something considerably more sophisticated, a genuine early warning system capable of relaying information about the hollow tide's approach across distances and communities that the deep current networks slower, more ambient pressure language struggled to reach with sufficient urgency. I never thought my quirk was meant for anything beyond rescue work, she admitted to Ryukyu one evening, the two of them resting briefly in the central chamber while Izuku continued his latest expedition toward the eastern current. I spent my whole career treating it as a tool for finding people in trouble, one rescue at a time. I never imagined it could become something an entire community relies on just to know danger is coming in time to actually do something about it. I think that's what happens when you stop being told your strength only counts if it fits inside a job description someone else wrote for you, Ryukyu said. I spent 20 years being valued for exactly the parts of myself the agencies found marketable. I don't think I ever discovered what the rest of my strength was actually capable of until I stopped needing anyone's permission to find out. Izuku returned from his fourth expedition toward the eastern current on the 19th week with information that struck both queens, once he had finished relating it, as considerably stranger and considerably more hopeful than the council's grim warnings had prepared them to expect. It's not a creature, he said, settling heavily into the central chamber, his vast form carrying the particular weariness of someone who had spent days swimming at the absolute edge of his endurance. Not in the way we've been assuming. I finally got close enough to actually observe the leading edge directly, and what's driving the hollow tide isn't a single hunting predator the way Maelgrave or even the Scuttler swarm were predators. It's a displacement. Something enormous is rising from depths even the Tide Warden has never fully explored, not hunting, not migrating with any deliberate purpose I could identify. It's simply rising, the way a bubble rises through water, and everything caught in its path is being displaced by the sheer volume of water it's pushing ahead of itself as it climbs. What is it? Ryukyu asked. I don't know yet, Izuku admitted. I got close enough to see the leading pressure wave, but not close enough to actually observe whatever's generating it. It's still descending in scale terms I have trouble fully processing, large enough that I think even my own colossal form would look small standing directly in its path. But here's the part that matters. It's not hostile. It's not hunting the communities in its path. It's simply too large to notice they exist, the same way a falling mountain doesn't hate the village it crushes. If we could find a way to either redirect its rising path, or warn it, somehow, that we're here in a way it could actually register, I think there's a real chance we wouldn't need anyone to flee at all. How do you warn something that large, Sirius asked, that it might not even perceive you exist? I don't know yet, Izuku admitted. But I think that's the actual problem worth solving, instead of the one the council's old tales assumed was the only option. Not how do we survive being crushed. How do we make ourselves visible enough, in whatever sense something that size actually perceives the world, that it chooses to rise somewhere that doesn't cost anyone their home. Chapter 26. The solution, when it finally arrived, came not from Izuku's careful analysis, nor from the Tide Warden's ancient accumulated wisdom, nor even from the Deep Current Council's considerable collective experience, but from Sirius, turning the problem over during a quiet evening in the gardens while watching her trained luminous fish respond, instantly and reliably, to the particular light patterns she had spent months teaching them to recognize. It perceives pressure, she said suddenly, interrupting a tense planning session in the central chamber with an urgency that startled both Ryukyu and Izuku into immediate, full attention. The Tide Warden said it's rising the way a bubble rises, displacing water as it climbs. That means it's responding to pressure differentials, the same way every other deep creature we've encountered responds to pressure as a primary sense. If it's too vast to perceive us visually, or even through the pressure language the deep current network uses for ordinary communication, maybe it could still perceive a pressure signal large enough, and coordinated enough, to actually register against something its own scale. You're suggesting we generate an artificial pressure wave, Izuku said slowly, the shape of the idea settling into place with growing clarity. Large enough that something that size would actually notice it, the same way the Tide Warden's testing waves registered against my own scale months ago. Not just generate one, Sirius said. Direct it. If we could coordinate enough of the kingdom's residents, and enough of the Deep Current Council's wider reach, into producing a single, sustained pressure signal precisely timed to intersect the hollow tide's rising path from a specific direction, we might actually be able to nudge its trajectory, the same way I taught small currents in the gardens to bend slightly using nothing but coordinated light and motion. Not stop it. I don't think anything could stop something that size. But redirect it, even slightly, away from the territories currently in its path, toward open ocean where its rising wouldn't cost anyone their home. Ryukyu absorbed the proposal with the particular careful skepticism of someone who had spent 20 years learning exactly how often ambitious plans collapsed under the weight of real-world execution. That would require coordinating dozens of communities across the entire radius the Tide Warden warned about, she said. Communities with no existing framework for this kind of large-scale cooperation, most of whom have spent their entire existence treating each other as rivals for limited territory rather than potential allies against a shared threat. It would, Izuku agreed. But I think that's exactly the kind of problem this kingdom was built to solve. We spent 4 months proving that cooperation, freely chosen rather than coerced, accomplishes more than conquest. I'd rather spend the next several weeks testing whether that's true at a scale large enough to actually matter, than spend them telling every vulnerable community in the Hollow Tide's path that flight is the only option available. The council, when Izuku presented Sirius's proposal 3 days later, received it with considerably more cautious interest than Ryukyu had privately expected, the Elder Ray studying the plan's mechanics with the same careful, methodical attention she had once brought to evaluating Izuku's own initial claim to sovereignty. It has never been attempted at this scale, she said finally. But I confess, young sovereign, that the alternative your kingdom has offered this council, across 4 months, has consistently proven more effective than the alternatives this council's own accumulated wisdom would have defaulted to alone. I am willing to risk the council's full coordination on an attempt I would have dismissed as impossible, had any other sovereign proposed it. I am considerably less willing to dismiss it, coming from the same kingdom that negotiated peace with a hungry swarm and earned the grudging respect of Maelgrave himself. The next 4 weeks consumed every resource the kingdom and the wider Deep Current Council could collectively muster, Izuku coordinating directly with sovereigns and communities across a radius considerably wider than anything he had previously attempted to organize, the Tide Warden lending its own ancient, accumulated authority to convince skeptical territory holders that cooperation, however unprecedented, represented their best remaining option, serious training and expanding network of bioluminescent communicators capable of relaying precise timing signals across distances that no single creature's natural communication range could otherwise hope to reach, and Ryukyu, drawing once again on decades of disaster coordination experience, organizing the staggered, carefully sequenced pressure contributions that the plan's actual execution would eventually require. We have one attempt at this, Izuku told the assembled coalition, on the eve of the Hollow Tide's projected arrival, his voice carrying through the Deep Current network with a clarity and authority that struck even the most skeptical of the participating sovereigns as considerably more commanding than the careful, deferential young claimant several of them had initially dismissed months earlier. If our timing is wrong, or our coordination fails, we will have spent 4 weeks of preparation for nothing, and the tide will simply continue toward whatever territories lay in its original path regardless. But I believe, after 4 months of building something this ocean has never quite seen before, that we have a genuine chance of proving cooperation can succeed where conquest and flight have always, previously, been the only options anyone considered. Chapter 27. The Hollow Tide announced its true arrival on the 23rd week not through any sound the deep ocean's residents recognized, but through a pressure shift so total that Ryukyu, holding her position at the coalition's western flank in full dragon form, felt it compress the water around her with a force that made even her considerable combat experience falter, briefly, before old discipline reasserted itself. It's here, Izuku's voice carried through the current network, steady despite the obvious strain of coordinating a response this vast and this unprecedented. Everyone hold position. We only get one chance at the timing. The thing that finally breached the deep dark ahead of them defied, even now, easy description, vast beyond any scale Izuku's own colossal form could meaningfully compare to, its shape obscured by the sheer volume of displaced water and silt churning around its rising bulk, less a creature in any conventional sense than a force of nature given barely coherent form, ancient beyond even the Tide Warden's considerable age, rising with the patient, unstoppable momentum of something that had never once needed to consider whether anything in its path mattered. Ryukyu understood, in the brief, vertiginous moment before the coordinated plan demanded her full attention, exactly why the old current tales described the Hollow Tide's passage only in terms of survival rather than confrontation. Nothing this size could be fought. Nothing this size, she suspected, even fully registered the existence of anything smaller than itself, the same way a falling mountain remained entirely indifferent to whatever it crushed beneath its descent. Now, Izuku's voice carried, sudden and absolute, and the coalition's 4 weeks of careful preparation finally, simultaneously, activated. Dozens of communities across the entire eastern current, sovereigns and scuttlers and luminous fish and ancient reef dwellers who had never once previously cooperated on anything beyond grudging non-aggression, released their coordinated pressure signal in a single, sustained wave, timed with a precision that Sirius's expanded communication network had spent weeks refining, directed with a careful geometric logic that Izuku himself had calculated across dozens of failed simulations before. Finally arriving at an angle he believed, with cautious, hard-won confidence, might actually register against something this size. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The hollow tide continued its vast, indifferent rise exactly as it had for however many ages its current path had carried it, and Ryukyu felt her own carefully maintained composure begin to fracture under the weight of watching weeks of preparation apparently fail to produce any visible effect at all. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the vast, churning displacement began to curve. It was a small adjustment, measured against the hollow tide's overwhelming scale, a deviation of perhaps a few degrees from its original trajectory, but Izuku, watching the shift unfold with the same careful, analytical attention he had once given to a notebook full of Quirk diagrams, understood immediately that a few degrees, sustained across the considerable remaining distance toward the territories that had originally lain in its path, would translate into a redirection of dozens of kilometers, more than enough to carry the tide's eventual rising point past every vulnerable community the coalition had spent weeks trying to protect. It's working, Sirius's voice carried through the network, something disbelieving and overjoyed in equal measure threading through the careful professionalism she had maintained throughout the tense weeks of preparation. Izuku, it's actually working. Hold the signal, Izuku said, though something in his own voice carried an unmistakable thread of the same disbelieving hope. We're not finished until it's fully clear of every territory in the original path. Hold until I give the signal to release. The coalition held its coordinated pressure wave for the better part of 6 grueling hours, every participating community pushing their accumulated strength and endurance toward a single, sustained purpose with a discipline that struck even the Tide Warden, observing from a respectful distance, as something it had genuinely never witnessed in an existence considerably longer than any other current tale could claim to measure. By the time Izuku finally gave the signal to release, the hollow tide's vast, ancient bulk had curved fully clear of the eastern current's settled territories, continuing its patient, indifferent rise toward open ocean where its eventual surfacing, whatever that surfacing ultimately revealed, would cost no community its home, no sovereign its territory, no family the kind of catastrophic, sudden displacement the old current tales had described as the hollow tide's only previous legacy. The coalition's collective exhaustion, in the aftermath, struck Ryukyu as something close to sacred. Dozens of communities who had cooperated, freely and without coercion, on a scale this ocean had genuinely never previously attempted, settling into a shared, accumulated relief that transcended whatever rivalries or wariness had separated them only weeks earlier. You did this, the Elder Ray told Izuku, once the immediate crisis had fully passed and the coalition had begun its slow, weary dispersal back toward individual territories. Not alone. I want to be clear about that, young sovereign, because I think the lesson here matters considerably more than the credit. You did not save this stretch of ocean through your own strength alone. You saved it by convincing dozens of communities that strength shared freely accomplishes what strength hoarded jealously never could. I do not think any sovereign in this council's considerable accumulated memory has ever attempted, let alone succeeded at, anything resembling what you have just shown this ocean is possible. I didn't do it to prove anything, Izuku said, exhaustion plain in every word, though something steady and certain remained beneath the fatigue. I did it because flight and destruction were the only 2 options anyone had ever considered, and I'd spent 4 months building something that taught me there's almost always a third option, if you're patient enough and humble enough to actually look for it. Chapter 28. The aftermath of the hollow tide's successful redirection reshaped the kingdom standing across the entire deep current network in ways that took several weeks to fully settle into their final, lasting shape. The Deep Current Council, in a formal session conducted with considerably more ceremony than their previous cautious recognition, extended Izuku a standing that the elder Ray described, with evident care for the precision of her language, as something this council has not previously possessed any framework to properly name, a recognition that went beyond mere territorial legitimacy into something closer to genuine, ocean-wide trust, the kind that communities scattered across dozens of leagues now extended not because any treaty demanded it, but because 4 months of consistent, demonstrated character had finally earned it. Maelgrave himself returned on the 26th week, considerably more subdued than his previous challenging visit, accompanied by a small delegation from the Southern Trench network that watched the exchange with evident, careful curiosity. "I heard of the hollow tide," he said, without preamble, once Izuku had granted him passage into the gardens. "I did not believe the current tales, at first. A migration event of that scale, redirected rather than simply endured, struck me as exactly the kind of exaggeration that accumulates around any sovereign ambitious enough to claim recognition before he has actually earned it. I came to see the truth myself." And, Izuku asked, careful, watching the older sovereign's posture for whatever genuine intent lay beneath the formal words. "The truth," Maelgrave admitted, "appears to have been, for once, considerably more impressive than the tale. I have spent considerable time, since our own encounter months ago, turning over the mercy you showed me, trying to understand what kind of strength chooses restraint when conquest would have cost it nothing. I think, watching what you have accomplished since, that I am finally beginning to understand. I did not come today to challenge you again, young sovereign. I came to ask whether the Southern Trench network might benefit from learning more of whatever this kingdom has built, beyond the old assumption that strength only ever means the right to take." Ryukyu, observing the exchange from beside Izuku, felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, slowly, as a kind of quiet, accumulated pride considerably larger than anything her old surface career had ever produced, watching a creature who had once arrived intent on conquest choose, instead, to ask for partnership. "We'd welcome that," Izuku said, simple and direct, the same openness he had offered every genuine approach since the kingdom's earliest, uncertain weeks. "I think this ocean has spent considerably longer than it needed to assuming strength and cruelty were the same thing. I'd like to spend whatever time I have left proving they never had to be." In the weeks that followed, the kingdom Izuku had once built alone, in desperate flight from a surface that called his existence a threat requiring containment, settled into something considerably larger and considerably more permanent than even he, in his most hopeful moments during those first solitary weeks of construction, had dared to fully imagine. Communities across an ever-widening radius of ocean floor began, cautiously at first and then with growing confidence, treating the basin's towers and gardens not merely as one sovereign's private domain, but as something closer to a capital, a place where disputes between smaller territories could be brought for careful, patient mediation, where vulnerable communities facing crises beyond their own resources could find genuine, uncoerced support, where the old, exhausting assumption that the deep ocean's only available currency was force finally, slowly, began to give way to something considerably more sustainable. Ryukyu found herself, in quieter moments, returning often to the central chamber's threshold, watching the garden's slow, patient bioluminescent pulse extend now toward the horizon in directions that had been bare, cold seabed only months earlier, and thinking, with the particular settled certainty of someone who had finally, fully, stopped questioning whether she had made the right choice, that whatever the surface world continued to believe about strength and worth and the proper shape of a hero's life, she had found, in this strange, vast, patient kingdom, something considerably truer than anything 20 years of agency service had ever offered her. Sirius, for her part, had begun training a new generation of the basin's luminous fish in increasingly sophisticated communication patterns, the early warning network that had once helped redirect a hollow tide now expanding into something closer to a genuine, ocean-wide nervous system, carrying news and warnings and simple, ordinary daily messages across distances that would have struck any surface technology as impossible to bridge without considerable mechanical assistance. And Izuku, sovereign of a kingdom that had grown, in 5 months, from a single desperate boy's flight into the dark into something the Deep Current Council now openly described as the most significant development this ocean had witnessed in longer than even its oldest residents could clearly measure, found himself, increasingly, simply happy, in the quiet, unglamorous, total way he had once told his queens he had never quite managed to feel on the surface, even on his very best days. Chapter 29. The surface world's reckoning with what had actually occurred during the hollow tide arrived considerably faster than Director Sakaki, or anyone in his commission, had been prepared to manage. The research vessels that had detected the anomalous current shift had recorded considerably more than the vague, unexplained readings Izuku's mother had described in her letter. Several oceanographic monitoring buoys, positioned across the Eastern Current network as part of an unrelated climate research initiative, had captured detailed pressure and seismic data spanning the full 6 hours of the coalition's coordinated effort, data that, once properly analyzed by commission scientists working considerably outside their usual expertise, suggested a coordinated, intentional redirection event of a scale that defied every existing model of deep ocean behavior. This is not natural phenomenon, the Commission's lead oceanographic analyst told Sakaki, in a briefing considerably more urgent than the agency's previous, careful deliberations regarding the Midoriya entity. This is engineering, Director. Someone, or something, with the capacity to coordinate dozens of distinct biological pressure sources across a radius of hundreds of kilometers, redirected what our models suggest was an extinction-level migration event away from populated coastal regions. If this data is accurate, and I have run the analysis 4 separate times specifically because I kept hoping I'd find an error, we are looking at an act of large-scale environmental protection that exceeds the combined capability of every hero agency and government oceanographic program on this planet, combined. Sakaki absorbed the analysis with the particular controlled stillness of a man recalculating, for what felt like the 3rd or 4th time in less than a year, the entire framework through which his agency had attempted to categorize an entity that had stopped, somewhere in the preceding months, fitting any category his commission had originally built to contain it. "You're certain this was the Midoriya entity?" he asked. "I'm certain it required capabilities and territorial reach that, as far as our current intelligence picture extends, only the Midoriya entity's documented kingdom currently possesses," the analyst said. Whether he acted alone or in coordination with other deep-sea powers, which the data's sheer geographic spread suggests is considerably more likely, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that whatever this entity has built down there, it just demonstrated the capacity to prevent a natural disaster on a scale that would have, by our most conservative estimates, displaced or destroyed at least 11 distinct coastal fishing communities along 3 separate national coastlines, had the original migration path proceeded uninterrupted. The implications of that single sentence rippled through the Commission's subsequent internal deliberations for the better part of 2 weeks, Sakaki convening meeting after meeting with increasingly senior officials, each conversation circling the same uncomfortable, unavoidable conclusion. The entity his commission had once classified as an uncontained public safety threat requiring stadium-scale containment had, 11 months after that classification, just quietly prevented a humanitarian catastrophe that no surface institution possessed the capability to even attempt addressing. "We need to revise our public position," one senior official argued, during the deliberations' final session. "If any version of this data becomes public, and given the number of research institutions now aware of the anomalous readings, I consider that increasingly inevitable, this Commission's original containment classification will look, in retrospect, like a catastrophic failure of judgment. We classified protection as threat. We attempted to cage exactly the kind of capability this country's coastal communities desperately needed, and we did it because the capability arrived in a shape we found politically inconvenient to acknowledge as heroic." Sakaki considered the assessment for a long moment, and Ryukyu, learning of the deliberations' eventual outcome weeks later through the same careful network of agency contacts she had cultivated since her departure, found herself genuinely surprised by the directness of his eventual response. "Draft a formal statement," Sakaki finally said. "Full acknowledgement. The Midoriya entity, publicly identified, with his own consent required before any release, credited formally for averting the Eastern Current incident. I want language that doesn't hedge, doesn't qualify, doesn't bury the acknowledgement in bureaucratic caution. If we got this wrong as badly as the data suggests we did, the only honest correction available to us now is admitting it plainly, and asking, rather than demanding, whether he would be willing to let the public understand what he actually is." The proposal reached Izuku through the same waterproof letter system that had carried every previous commission communication, and he spent the better part of 3 days turning it over with Ryukyu and Sirius before reaching a decision that surprised even himself with how readily it arrived, once he had finally allowed himself to consider it seriously. "I don't need their credit," he told his queens, the letter resting unopened beside him in the central chamber's warm stone alcove. "I didn't redirect the hollow tide for recognition. But I think there's something else worth considering here, something beyond whether I personally need the acknowledgement." "What's that?" Ryukyu asked. "If the surface finally understands that strength like mine doesn't have to mean threat," Izuku said slowly, working through the thought as he spoke it, "then maybe the next person who manifests something the surface doesn't immediately know how to categorize gets a different response than the one I got. Maybe they don't have to choose between a stadium and the bottom of the ocean. Maybe acknowledging what actually happened during the hollow tide does something more important than restoring my own reputation. Maybe it changes, even slightly, what the surface assumes is possible, the next time someone like me is born into a world that doesn't yet have room for them." Sirius felt something move through her chest at the careful, deliberate generosity of the reasoning, the particular selflessness of someone choosing to risk his own hard-won privacy and peace for the sake of a stranger he would likely never meet, simply because he understood, better than almost anyone alive, exactly how much that stranger might need the world to have already proven such mercy was possible. "That's a very you reason to say yes," she said, something warm and proud in her voice. "I'll respond," Izuku said finally. "Not with full disclosure of everything, the kingdom's exact location, the council's full structure, the considerable, accumulated trust this ocean has finally extended me. Some of that needs to remain protected, for the kingdom's own safety and for the safety of every community now sheltering under its wider influence. But I'll let them acknowledge the truth about the hollow tide. I'll let them tell whatever story helps the next person like me believe there's a third option besides a cage or the deepest part of the ocean." Chapter 30. The Commission's formal acknowledgement, when it finally reached public release 3 weeks later, reshaped the surface world's understanding of the missing UA student in ways that none of the 3 sovereigns of the deep had fully anticipated, despite months of careful preparation for exactly this possibility. The story, carefully worded according to the specific limits Izuku had negotiated, described a UA student who had manifested an unprecedented heteromorphic transformation quirk of extraordinary scale, who had relocated, by his own informed choice, to a self-governed maritime territory beyond conventional agency jurisdiction, and who had, 11 months after his departure, single-handedly coordinated an unprecedented act of environmental protection that had averted catastrophic damage to multiple coastal communities. It named him. It included, with his explicit permission, a single carefully chosen photograph from his training days at UA. A small, useful corrective against the considerable rumor and speculation that had accumulated in his absence, alongside an official statement attributed to Director Sakaki himself, acknowledging, with a directness that surprised even Ryukyu's considerable cynicism about Commission public relations, that the agency's original containment classification had been a misjudgment the Commission now formally regretted. The public response, in the days that followed, exceeded anything Izuku had privately prepared himself to expect. His old classmates found ways to reach him, slowly, carefully, through the same waterproof letter network Ryukyu had long since perfected, messages that arrived in a steady, accumulating stream over the following weeks, Ochiko's careful, joyful relief, expressed across 4 full pages that took Izuku the better part of an evening to fully absorb, Ida's formal, earnest pride, somehow managing to convey enormous warmth despite a writing style that remained, even now, characteristically rigid. Bakugo's furious, barely legible scrawl that amounted, beneath its considerable surface aggression, to something Izuku recognized immediately as profound, hard-won relief that had simply never learned any gentler way to express itself. All Might's letter arrived separately, and took Izuku considerably longer than any of the others to finally open. The old, complicated weight of a mentor's recommendation that had once amounted, in practice, to a vote for containment sitting heavily between them even now. "I was wrong," the letter began, with a directness that struck Izuku as almost startling, coming from a man he had once known primarily through carefully measured public confidence. "I told myself, at the time, that recommending the contained facility was the safest path for everyone, including you. I told myself that safety mattered more than freedom, when the stakes seemed large enough. I have spent 11 months watching the consequences of that recommendation unfold from a considerable, helpless distance, and I want you to know, plainly, without the careful hedging I once specialized in, I was wrong, and you were right to refuse what I recommended, and what you have built since refusing it has taught me more about what real heroism actually requires than my entire career ever managed to teach me on my own. I am proud of you, Midoriya. I should have found a way to say that the day you needed to hear it most, instead of 11 months later, after you'd already proven it true without my help. Izuku read the letter alone, in the quiet privacy of the gardens, and found himself, for the first time in many months, genuinely uncertain how to feel. The old, complicated grief of a boy who had once believed All Might's approval was the single most important thing in the world, warring, gently, with the settled, hard-won peace of a sovereign who had long since stopped needing that approval to know his own worth. I think I forgive him, he told Ryukyu and Sirius, later that evening, something quiet and considered in the admission. Not because the recommendation didn't hurt. It did, more than almost anything else that happened during those 4 days. But I think I understand, now, in a way I couldn't at 16, that even people who genuinely love you can still be wrong about what you need, especially when the world around them has spent their entire lives teaching them that safety and freedom are opposites. I don't think I need him to have been right, anymore, to still value what he taught me. I think both things can be true. He was wrong about the cage. He was right that I had something worth protecting. I get to keep the second truth without needing the first one to disappear entirely. That's a considerably more generous response than I think most people could manage, Ryukyu said, gentle, watching the careful, settled peace in his expression with something that looked, on her own face, like quiet admiration. I think the kingdom taught me that, too, Izuku said. Generosity isn't really a surface virtue or a deep ocean virtue. I think it's just the thing that becomes possible, once you've stopped needing anyone's validation to know who you actually are. His mother's response to the public acknowledgement arrived not as a letter, but as something Izuku had not anticipated at all, a request, conveyed carefully through Ryukyu's established channel, asking whether his mother might be permitted, just once, to see him, not on the surface, not in any setting that would risk the kingdom's careful, hard-won privacy, but somewhere safe, somewhere private, where a mother who had spent nearly a year not knowing whether her son was even truly alive might finally see, with her own eyes, that he was. I think I'm ready for that, Izuku said, once Ryukyu had relayed the request, something equal parts nervous and overjoyed moving through his vast, ancient expression in a way that struck both his queens, watching, as profoundly, achingly human despite the scale and strangeness of the body it moved through. I think I've been ready for longer than I let myself admit. I just needed the rest of this to be solid first, the kingdom, the council, the proof that this life could actually hold steady, before I asked her to trust that the son she's about to see is happy, and safe, and exactly where he's supposed to be. Chapter 31. The letter from his mother arrived again on the kingdom's 28th week, carried by the same careful, untracked method Ryukyu had established months earlier, and this time, Izuku found himself reading it not with the raw, uncertain grief that had accompanied her first letter, but with something steadier, something that had grown, over months of building and protecting and slowly, patiently earning a kind of peace he had once believed impossible. I saw something on the news today, his mother had written, that made me think of you more than usual, though I suppose almost everything makes me think of you these days. They're calling it an unexplained oceanic event, some enormous current shift far out at sea that several research vessels detected but couldn't fully explain. The reporters seemed frightened by it, the way people get frightened by things they can't categorize. I wasn't frightened. I don't know why, exactly, except that some part of me has started to trust that whatever you've become, whatever you're building down there, you'd find a way to make something frightening into something safe, the same way you always did, even as a little boy, finding the gentlest way through every hard thing life put in front of you. I don't need you to tell me if that event was somehow yours. I think I already know. I just wanted you to know that I'm proud of you, in whatever shape you're in now, doing whatever work you found down there that the rest of us don't have eyes to see. Izuku read the letter 3 times before he finally set it aside, something warm and steady settling through his vast, scaled chest that he recognized, slowly, as a feeling he had spent his entire surface life chasing without ever quite catching, the simple, total certainty of being known, and loved, exactly as he actually was, without any condition attached, without any need to perform a smaller, more palatable version of his own strength in order to earn it. She knows, he told Ryukyu and Sirius that evening, settling into the central chamber's warm stone with something that looked, on his vast, ancient face, unmistakably like peace. About the hollow tide. She didn't ask me to confirm it. She just wanted me to know she was proud, whatever the truth actually was. That's not nothing, Ryukyu said, gentle, understanding the particular weight of the admission. That's about as close to unconditional as anything the surface has ever offered you. I think I'm ready, Izuku said slowly, after a long moment, to actually tell her everything. Not just that I'm happy. The whole truth, the kingdom, the council, the hollow tide, all of it. I think I've spent 5 months proving to myself that this life is real and sustainable before I felt ready to ask her to fully understand it. I think I'm finally there. Sirius felt something warm settle behind her own ribs, watching the careful, deliberate joy in his admission, the slow, patient unfolding of a boy who had once been told he had nothing worth protecting, finally, fully, claiming the right to be entirely known by the one person whose unconditional love had never once, in his entire life, actually required him to prove anything at all. Then let's write it together, she said. All 3 of us. I think she deserves to hear, in whatever way a letter can manage it, exactly how much you've built, and exactly how much you're loved, by people who chose you with open eyes and never once looked back. The letter they composed that evening took considerably longer than any previous correspondence, Izuku dictating carefully while Ryukyu transcribed and Sirius offered, periodically, the careful, perceptive additions that came from having watched the entire 5-month journey unfold from the closest possible vantage, and when it was finally finished, sealed in the same careful waterproof method that had carried every previous message safely across the considerable distance between the kingdom and the surface, Izuku found himself feeling something he had not expected to feel this completely, watching Ryukyu prepare to carry it toward the same quiet stretch of coastline that had received every previous letter. I think this is the first time, he said slowly, that I've felt completely whole, telling someone the entire truth about what I've become. Not the careful, partial truth I gave the commission. Not even the full truth I've shared with both of you, though that mattered more than I think I ever properly told you. This is different. This is the truth reaching the one person who loved me before any of this happened, and loves me now, exactly the same, on the other side of everything that's changed. That's what real love actually looks like, Ryukyu said, settling beside him with the easy, total comfort of 5 months of accumulated trust. Not changing to match whoever you become. Just staying steady, exactly as steady as it always was, while you become whoever you were always going to become anyway. I think I finally understand that now, Izuku said. I spent 16 years thinking love had to be earned, proven, justified through usefulness. I think the kingdom taught me otherwise, eventually. I think you both taught me otherwise, longer before the kingdom ever fully understood the lesson itself. The gardens beyond the central chamber pulsed their slow, patient bioluminescent rhythm into the deep, settled dark, towers rising now across a horizon that had been bare, cold seabed only 5 months earlier, ancient guardians and reformed swarms and rescued reefs and an entire, growing network of communities who had learned, slowly and through demonstrated example rather than empty promise, that strength and mercy had never actually needed to be opposites. Chapter 32. The reunion, when it finally arrived 3 weeks later, took place not on the surface, and not in the kingdom's full, vast depths, but at a careful, deliberate midpoint. Izuku had spent considerable thought selecting a shallow, sunlit cove perhaps 30 meters deep, close enough to a quiet, uninhabited stretch of coastline that his mother could reach it by a short boat journey arranged through Ryukyu's careful, untraceable coordination, distant enough from any populated shore that no curious onlooker or persistent commission asset could threaten the privacy this moment demanded. He arrived first, settling into the cove's gentle, sun-warmed water in the smaller, serpentine form he had learned to favor for encounters that called for presence without overwhelming scale, his bioluminescent markings dimmed to a soft, careful glow that would not frighten someone unprepared for the full intensity of what he had become, and he waited, coiled patiently among sunlit kelp fronds that swayed gently in the cove's mild current, with a nervousness that struck him, distantly, as Almost absurd, given everything else he had faced and overcome in the preceding 11 months. Ryukyu and Sirius remained at a respectful distance, present but deliberately apart, understanding without needing to discuss it that whatever unfolded in the next several minutes belonged entirely to a mother and son who had spent nearly a year believing they might never see each other again. The small boat arrived precisely on schedule, and Izuku felt his vast chest tighten with an anticipation that had nothing to do with any threat or crisis, watching a familiar, beloved figure lean carefully over the boat's railing, dark hair pulled back the same practical way she had always worn it, her face carrying 11 months of accumulated worry that had clearly never fully released its grip, even after every letter, even after every careful, hard-won reassurance. "Izuku," she called out, her voice carrying across the coast's calm surface with a tremor that broke something open in his chest he had not fully realized remained closed. He surfaced slowly, deliberately, the same careful patience he had once shown approaching Ryukyu and Sirius for the very first time, allowing her every possible moment to adjust to the sight of him, vast and scaled and lit with soft, patient bioluminescence, nothing at all like the boy she remembered raising, and yet, in every way that mattered, exactly the same son who had once filled notebooks with careful, obsessive hero analysis at her kitchen table. "Mom," he said, and the word, carried through air and water both in that familiar dual resonance, broke whatever careful composure she had managed to maintain through the entire boat journey, her hands flying to her mouth, tears spilling freely down a face that Izuku watched shift, in the span of a few heartbeats, through shock and disbelief and finally, unmistakably, into pure, overwhelming relief. "You're really you," she said, half question, half confirmation, leaning further over the boat's railing than was strictly safe, reaching one trembling hand toward the water as though needing the physical confirmation that touch alone could provide. "It's really me," Izuku said, and lowered his vast head carefully, slowly, until the gentle, scaled curve of his cheek rested, with a tenderness that belied his overwhelming size, against her outstretched palm. She wept then, openly, the careful, contained grief of 11 months finally given permission to fully release, and Izuku held perfectly still, patient and steady, exactly the way he had learned, over months of careful practice, to hold himself for everything precious and fragile that came within his reach. "I'm so sorry," she said eventually, once the worst of the tears had passed, still resting her hand against his cheek as though reluctant to ever fully let go. "I'm sorry it took this long. I'm sorry I couldn't find a way to reach you sooner, to tell you in person instead of through letters that I never stopped believing you were still in there, still my son, whatever shape the world forced you into." "You have nothing to apologize for," Izuku said, gentle, certain. "None of this was your fault. You loved me exactly the same, through every letter, without ever once asking me to be smaller or different or easier to explain to people who couldn't understand. That's not something I needed to forgive. That's something I needed to thank you for, every single day since the first letter reached me." She studied him for a long moment, his vast, ancient eye, his bioluminescent markings pulsing gently in the cove's dappled sunlight, the impossible scale of a body that bore no resemblance to the boy she had once tucked into bed, and something in her expression settled, slowly, into a kind of total, unconditional acceptance that struck even Izuku, who had spent months trusting in exactly this outcome, as more moving than he had fully prepared himself to receive. "You look happy," she said finally, wonder threading through the simple observation. "I've been so afraid, for so long, that whatever happened to you would have cost you that. I think some part of me expected to find you here today carrying the same exhausted, desperate weight you carried in your last year at UA, just wearing a different shape. I didn't expect to find you like this. Settled. Peaceful. Actually, truly happy." "I am," Izuku said, simple and direct. "I built something down here that no one ever told me I couldn't have. I found people who love me without needing anything from me first. I learned that strength doesn't have to mean what the surface always told me it meant. I think, for the first time in my entire life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing." He introduced her to Ryukyu and Sirius, both queens approaching the boat with careful, deliberate gentleness, and Izuku watched his mother's face shift again, processing the introduction with the particular swift, total acceptance that had always characterized her response to anything that mattered deeply to her son. Thank you, she told them both, simple and direct, the same plain, unadorned sincerity Izuku remembered from countless ordinary moments of his childhood. For choosing him. For staying with him, when the rest of the world made that choice so difficult. I don't think I can ever fully express what it means, knowing he's not alone down here, knowing he has people who love him exactly as he is. We chose him because he's worth choosing, Ryukyu said, simple, certain. I don't think either of us has ever once regretted it. The visit lasted the better part of an afternoon, Izuku's mother sharing careful, ordinary updates about life on the surface, the slow, gradual healing of his old classmates' worry into genuine, settled relief, small details about a life that continued, in his absence, exactly as life always continued, carrying its ordinary rhythms forward even through extraordinary grief, and Izuku found himself, listening, feeling a kind of bridge finally, fully built between the boy he had been and the sovereign he had become, a bridge that did not require him to abandon either shape, only to hold both, carefully and completely, the same way he held everything precious that came within his vast, careful reach. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, and the small boat's return journey grew unavoidably necessary, Izuku's mother pressed her palm once more against his scaled cheek, lingering, reluctant, in the particular way that every parent's goodbye carried an entire unspoken weight of love too large for any single gesture to fully contain. Will I see you again? She asked, careful, hopeful, having learned, over 11 months, not to assume anything about this strange new shape her son's life had taken. Whenever you need to, Izuku said. This cove will always be here. I'll always come, the moment you ask. That's not going to change, no matter how much this kingdom grows, or how many seasons pass, or how strange the rest of my life continues to become. You will always, always be able to find me. That's all I needed to hear, she said, and finally, gently, let her hand fall away, stepping back from the railing as the boat's engine began, slowly, to carry her back toward the distant, sunlit shore. Izuku watched her departure until the boat had fully vanished beyond the cove's outer rocks, and then, for a long, quiet moment, simply floated in the gentle, sun-warmed water, feeling something settle through his vast chest that he recognized, finally and completely, as the last piece of an old, unfinished grief he had carried since the night he first climbed out of a dormitory window toward a titiline he could not yet fully explain. She knows, he said finally, to his waiting queens. She really knows, now. Not just that I'm alive. That I'm whole. That I'm happy. That this was never a tragedy, whatever it looked like from the surface. It was a beginning. Ryukyu settled beside him in the gentle current, her dragon form catching the same soft, dappled sunlight that had warmed the entire reunion, and Sirius drifted close on his other side, her constellation patterns glowing faintly even in the bright surface light, and together, the three of them turned, unhurried, back toward the deep, patient dark that had become, over 5 long, transformative months, the truest home any of them had ever known. The kingdom waited below, towers rising, gardens blooming, ancient guardians settling into their slow, watchful rest, a community built from mercy and patience and the radical, hard-won belief that strength could mean something other than the right to take, and as the three of them descended together, leaving the last of the surface's thin, golden light behind, Izuku understood, with the same total, settled certainty that had carried him through every crisis and every quiet, accumulating joy of the preceding months, that whatever came next, whatever the deep ocean's vast, patient future still held in store, he would face it exactly as he had faced everything since that first desperate, hopeful descent, surrounded by everyone who had chosen him freely, building something the surface had never believed was possible, one patient, deliberate, mercy-shaped choice at a time. It had never needed a name to be real. It had simply needed time and patience, and 3 people willing to choose each other without condition. In the deep, warm dark where the surface's old, narrow rules about strength and worth had never once been allowed to follow them down.